Let's say things with Russia turn into the worst-case scenario. A deranged, desperate Vladimir Putin sees his regime about to collapse. In a last-ditch effort to take as many enemies with him as possible, he orders a massive launch of Russia's nuclear arsenal, targeting the West. As the silos open, hundreds or thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads streak away at speeds of 15,000 miles per hour. But where are they headed? Thankfully, this hypothetical remains very, very unlikely. Unfortunately, it's also not entirely impossible. Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile, with nearly 6,000 weapons and roughly 1,600 actively deployed warheads. The question of where these might strike if fired is one that experts and policymakers have worried about since the days of the Cold War. Now, with nuclear threats once rising again, it's worth looking at how such a doomsday scenario might play out. In this video, we'll take a look at the places Russia might target with a nuclear barrage, starting in the United States. Some of the first US targets for a Russian nuclear strike are the major centers of power you would expect. The Pentagon is among the most important of these, as it acts as the headquarters for the US Department of Defense. If Russia were able to damage or destroy the Pentagon, it would be an enormous blow to the command structure of the US military. It would likely not cripple the US armed forces, but would cause a major disruption and make it far more difficult for the US to organize a response. Because of the size of the nuclear blast and its fallout, a strike on the Pentagon would also likely destroy much of Washington, D.C. Some 713,000 people live in D.C., while more than 6.3 million live in the greater D.C. area. Estimates for a nuclear strike on the Pentagon indicate that close to 500,000 people could be killed instantly, with many more falling sick from radioactive fallout afterwards. The initial blast would vaporize the Pentagon itself and anything else within a half-mile radius. Damage from the strike would radiate outwards some 4 miles from the epicenter, including the area containing the US Capitol building, White House, and Supreme Court. While the nuclear fireball and the enormous shockwave following it would be deadly on their own, it is the potential for widespread radiation which would create the biggest hazard. Radiation anywhere near the blast would be intense enough to cause third-degree burns, while also causing many harmful mutations in victims' DNA, leading to cellular degeneration and cancer. Even if people in the larger blast radius managed to survive the explosion, there's a good chance they would die from the huge amount of radiation exposure. The White House is roughly 2.17 miles from the Pentagon, putting it well within the damage zone of a nuclear blast. If the president were there, they would likely be killed by the force of the shockwave, even if the White House and Capitol were not targeted independently. Thousands of US officials and workers would certainly be killed, sending the government into crisis mode. The president would declare a state of emergency and likely invoke martial law. If the president were killed, the next in the line of succession would be the vice president, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State, and so on until someone alive could be reached. Besides the institutions around Washington, D.C., the second major goal of a Russian nuclear attack would be to strike as many US missile silos as possible in order to minimize a retaliatory strike. There is almost no chance this would be totally effective, as the US has nearly as many nuclear weapons as Russia, in addition to advanced early warning systems, nuclear submarines hidden around the world, and powerful air defense systems. But Russia would certainly try to take out as many silos as possible, especially those bases with Minuteman III ICBMs, which would mean targeting some very remote parts of the US. One of these is Malmstrom Air Force Base, located deep in the state of Montana. There are around 3,400 military personnel and 1,000 civilians working at Malmstrom, many responsible for the 150 Minuteman III nuclear missiles housed at the base. If a Russian nuclear weapon were able to strike Malmstrom, it would likely kill everyone at the base, plus nearly 15,000 people in the nearby towns of Black Eagle and Great Falls. The number of injured would be nearly double, even though the area is very sparsely populated. But high casualties would not be the goal of a strike on Malmstrom, as Russia would only be trying to cripple the ability of ICBMs to be fired from the base. The effects of a nuclear strike on the local environment would be devastating. Water flowing through the Mississippi River near the impact site would instantly vaporize, while the flow from upstream would eventually pass through the irradiated area around Malmstrom. The river would carry radioactive particles downstream, potentially all the way down its length. It would take months or years for any water drawn from nearby sources to be drinkable. In the meantime, large amounts of animals could die of radiation poisoning. even those hundreds of miles away. The ecological effect of such a shock would be felt across the country, and Malmstrom is far from the only target in a potential nuclear attack by Russia. Another key base likely to be targeted by Russia is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The base contains roughly another 150 Minuteman III missiles and a staff of 3,200 military personnel and 420 civilians. However, the town of Minot is also more populous, with nearly 50,000 people. There would likely be over 23,000 immediate casualties, with another 20,000 suffering from injuries and radiation sickness. Like Malmstrom, any strike on Minot AFB would also cause huge environmental damage, with radioactive fallout contaminating groundwater, soil, and air. The final ICBM silo which Russia would likely attempt to first strike on would be Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The ICBMs there would be a harder target since they are actually spread around in silos between Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. The base has roughly similar numbers of staff and missiles to Malmstrom and Minot, and casualties from a strike would exceed 25,000. Cheyenne, Wyoming would also be devastated, and anyone present would receive a high dose of radiation. In addition to the major silos, a Russian nuclear attack would also target command and control centers across the country. Many of these are similarly hidden in rural locations around the US, often in plain sight. One major target would be the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD headquarters at Peterson Air Base in Colorado. NORAD is a joint organization made up of US and Canadian service members and civilians, responsible for aerospace protection of North America. Unfortunately, Peterson Base has over 8,700 active duty personnel, 1,300 reservists, 1,900 civilian staff, 10,000 family members, and over 20,000 veterans. The base also sits just outside the city of Colorado Springs, which has a population of nearly 500,000. A nuclear strike in this area would probably kill more than 60,000 people outright, and injure or irradiate another 200,000. Contamination of the water, air, and soil would again render much of the area uninhabitable, while winds could carry it into Kansas and other neighboring states. Another major target is Offutt Air Force Base, just outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Offutt is the headquarters of the U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, responsible for strategic nuclear deterrence, global strike, and operating the Defense Department's global information grid. STRATCOM is critical to the operation of the larger U.S. military. If a nuclear warhead struck Offutt Air Force Base, it could kill more than 40,000 and injure nearly 150,000. It would also seriously degrade the U.S. ability to coordinate a military response and potentially create confusion within the command structure of the armed forces. Similarly, the nearby city of Omaha would be largely destroyed, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. The Missouri River would also be contaminated, leading to the deaths of wildlife and a drop in biodiversity. In the event that STRATCOM was hit with a nuclear strike, its command would be transferred to one of the other 10 command and control centers around the country. The new command would oversee preparations for a retaliatory nuclear strike, which could happen almost instantly, since Russia would be hard-pressed to cripple the US nuclear triad. Yet another potential target for Russian nukes would be the VLF, or Very Low Frequency Transmitter in Cutler, Maine. This station transmits one-way communications to submarines in the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet, allowing them to carry out strikes if necessary. Cutler transmits its messages at 24 kHz and only uses 1.8 megawatts of power, a relatively low data rate. It is Cutler Base which sends launch codes to US Ohio-class nuclear submarines in the Atlantic, which form the most difficult leg of the nuclear triad for any enemy to deal with. By destroying Cutler, Russia could theoretically cut off US contact with the subs and make a retaliatory strike harder. While immediate loss of life from a strike on Cutler would be under 1,000, its position on the Atlantic coast means that ocean life and coastal ecosystems would take most of the damage. There is also Cutler's counterpart in Washington, the Jim Creek Naval Radio Station, which transmits to the Pacific Fleet. It also sits in a remote area with few potential casualties, but again, air and water contamination from radiation could reach both Seattle and Vancouver, potentially making life in both cities hazardous. The blast would also create huge forest fires in Washington, which could burn for weeks on end, creating even more hazardous air conditions. Russia would also target bases on Hawaii, which sits roughly 2,000 miles from the US mainland. On the island of Oahu is another VLF transmitter, which can relay orders to the Pacific submarine fleet if the Jim Creek installation is damaged or destroyed. The Lualue transmitter unfortunately also makes Hawaii a prime target, as it provides redundancy for fleet communications. A Russian ICBM strike on Oahu would also be extremely deadly, as it is the most populated Hawaiian island, with over 1 million people at any given time. Due to its isolation and contained ecology, a nuclear strike on Oahu could make almost the entire island uninhabitable. There are also very few places for people to hide from such an attack, so anyone on the island would either die quickly or be in serious trouble. Since Hawaii also plays host to multiple US naval bases such as Pearl Harbor, there is also a good chance that the state would be hit with multiple missiles, leaving no places for easy evacuation. Every one of these is a strategic military installation, but even just nuclear strikes on these positions would kill many hundreds of thousands of Americans. The effect of a nuclear attack on multiple US cities would be far, far deadlier. If Putin truly opted for nuclear war, there is no reason to think he would do it halfway, and hitting the US's major cities would also destroy their economic capacity. In a first-strike nuclear scenario, each side would try to devastate the other beyond recovery, and that means the widespread targeting of civilians. Such an attack could easily be the deadliest in human history, far exceeding the only past uses of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Outside of Washington, D.C., New York is the most obvious civilian target. It is both the financial capital of the United States and its largest city, as well as a global symbol of American power. It goes without saying that a nuclear explosion in Manhattan would be beyond devastating. The island is only 13.4 miles long, but it is one of the most densely populated areas in the entire country. An 800-kiloton nuclear warhead would instantly kill between 1.5 and 2 million people, with another 3 to 5 million seriously injured from radiation, burns, or collapsed buildings. The 5 boroughs of New York City collectively have almost 8.5 million, and every single one would have their lives upended. Even for those who avoid the initial blast or fireball, the shockwave's 500-mile-per-hour winds could prove fatal. As researchers recently wrote in New York Magazine, it would demolish the flimsiest buildings and strip the walls and roofs off stronger structures, leaving only their naked and warped scaffolding. It would snap utility poles like toothpicks and rip through trees, fling people through the air, and turn brick, glass, wood, and metal into deadly projectiles. A blast in Times Square, combined with the fireball, would carve a crater 50 feet deep at the center of the explosion. The shockwave would reach a diameter of nearly 3.2 miles, shattering windows as far as Gramercy Park and the American Museum of Natural History. The city's medical infrastructure would strain or collapse under the burden, especially with many major hospitals destroyed. Similarly, evacuation from Manhattan and other boroughs would be extremely difficult due to the destroyed buildings, collapsed tunnels and bridges, and press of people trying to escape. Nuclear blasts also release a strong electromagnetic pulse, which would knock out vital systems across the city, including electronic communication, medical technology, and the power grid itself. This would make any emergency response vastly more difficult and lead to even greater casualties. Yet in the event of a real nuclear war, Russia wouldn't stop there. Los Angeles is another obvious target, as the country's second-largest city and a major source of American wealth and cultural power. LA is not as densely populated as New York City, with some 4 million inhabitants and sprawling, low-rise housing. But at this point, we probably don't need to tell you that a nuclear blast in downtown LA would also be apocalyptic. 500,000 to 700,000 could die instantly, with 1.5 million more injured. LA also has roughly 5.5 million cars and little public transportation. Because of this, major roads even well outside the blast zone would be almost impossible to use as people flee from the radioactive fallout. LA's chronic drought would also be made far worse, potentially leaving millions without safe drinking water. In the middle of the country, Chicago and its nearly 3 million residents would also likely be targeted. A nuclear blast here could kill 500,000 to 600,000 instantly and badly injure over 1 million, while a large portion of the blast would explode into Lake Michigan, with winds spreading the fallout north, south, and east. The heavily populated Great Lakes region would be at risk and probably need to be evacuated as well. To have any chance in a nuclear war, Putin would need to go all out before the West could overwhelm Russia's limited defenses. Because of the effects of wind, even a small percentage of the nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal could spread fallout across much of the United States and make many areas completely uninhabitable. Being far away from the actual impact sites still might not be a guarantee of safety, especially in more densely populated parts of the country, Since 80% of Americans live east of the Mississippi River, any nuclear strike on the eastern seaboard would be especially deadly. Overall, estimates suggest that the total number killed, injured, or exposed to radiation in a full Russian nuclear attack could exceed 256 million. That's 3/4 of the population just in the United States. But an attack on the US would also leave Russia open to retaliation from other NATO countries, meaning that they too would almost certainly be targeted early in a nuclear conflict. This would mean major European military installations like Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which coordinates NATO's air and missile defense networks. Spotters at Ramstein would be among the first to know if a country like Russia actually launched nuclear ICBMs, but due to its relative geographic proximity, there will be little time for a possible evacuation. A nuclear blast over Ramstein would kill some 30,000 people, while winds could potentially carry fallout across the continent. Assuming a retaliatory strike didn't just wipe Moscow off the map, this also makes European targets riskier for Putin in the event of a nuclear attack, since at least some fallout could make it all the way back to the Kremlin. Other military targets in Europe which might be targeted include NATO's Supreme Allied Command in Belgium, as well as other US bases in Europe, like Caserma Ederle in Italy, which hosts the US's powerful 173rd Airborne Brigade. Strategically or economically important cities in Europe are also potential targets. This includes London, the most populous city in Western Europe, with over 8.8 million people. The UK also has roughly 200 nuclear weapons of its own, which also might make it a high-risk target. Similarly to New York City, a nuclear explosion over London could instantly kill over 1 million, while total casualties from the shockwave and radiation could be over 2.3 million. London is also the capital of the UK, meaning that its government would also likely perish in the blast. As with other cities, London's vital infrastructure would also be completely devastated, making any emergency response very difficult. And coastal winds coming off the Atlantic could carry the radiation north into Scotland, and west into France and other parts of continental Europe. Long story short, anywhere in the world getting hit with a modern nuclear weapon would be a horrifying scenario. While this hypothetical is obviously incredibly unlikely to happen, it's also pretty obvious that if it did, there would be basically no good options. Because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which has kept nuclear war at bay since the 1950s, governments like the US are ridiculously unprepared to deal with the consequences if it did happen. As the article in New York Magazine recently put it, more than 70 years ago, America became the first and only country to use nuclear weapons in war. Despite witnessing the immediate and enduring horror of those attacks, despite decades of technological advances in nuclear warfare, the US remains shockingly unprepared for a similar assault on its own soil. Much of the short-term response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, adapted from plans meant for other kinds of disasters. Putin knows that firing even a single nuclear weapon would likely mean the end of him and possibly much of Russia. But the fact remains that nukes are out there and could theoretically be used at any time in the future. In an increasingly uncertain world, it wouldn't hurt governments around the world to step up their nuclear preparations, because the fact is, it's impossible to know the future. But what do you think? What would the targets for a Russian nuclear attack be? And just how unprepared is the world for that small possibility? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Will Putin eventually completely lose his marbles and start a nuclear war? This isn't just a hypothetical question, and here's why. Since the start of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the omnipresent threat of nuclear escalation has loomed over the conflict like a dark cloud. When Russia's fortunes decline, the world tends to hold its breath. The rationality of the man with his finger on the nuclear button makes it hard to predict whether further defeat and embarrassment on the battlefield will drive him closer to a nuclear contingency. Now, with news emerging that Putin has officially revoked Russia's ratification of a global nuclear test ban, uncertainty is rising. Introduced in 1996, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, was designed to prevent all nuclear explosions worldwide, including those performed during a nuclear test. Having adhered to the ban for more than 2 decades, Putin's landmark about-face is worth keeping an eye on, the latest in a series of calculated moves to intimidate Ukraine and its Western supporters. Putin's decision underscores the paucity of military options available to him as his force is depleted and his regional military aims go unrealized. Sure, this could just be the type of nuclear saber-rattling that we've grown accustomed to, but the news could also prove catastrophic. With thousands of nuclear weapons in its arsenal, the resumption of nuclear testing by Russia is just the type of escalatory sign the world has hoped to avoid ever since the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. What was Russia's rationale for making this change? And what bearing might it have on the conflict in Ukraine and the future nuclear relations between the world's superpowers? First, Putin's rationale. Citing their own security interests, unsurprisingly, Russian leaders claim the decision was adopted in response to the United States' own blatant disregard for the global nuclear test ban. And technically they're right. Ironically, the US itself never ratified the CTBT when it was passed in 1996. To understand why, we should go back in time to understand why the CTBT came about in the first place. Introduced at the end of the Cold War, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty imposed a global suspension on all nuclear testing above or below ground. It was proposed by UN mandate 33 years after the American and Soviet superpowers came dangerously close to mutually assured destruction during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. In the immediate aftermath of that standoff, delegates from both nations entered into negotiations to sign a limited nuclear test ban treaty, an agreement which allowed nations to conduct underground nuclear tests but went so far as to prohibit nuclear experimentation underwater, in Earth's atmosphere, and in space. Signed by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, at the time, the treaty was overwhelmingly supported by the American Senate, which approved it in an 80-19 margin. Many hailed the limited test ban treaty as the start of warming relations and closer cooperation between President John F. Kennedy's United States government and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's communist regime. Indeed, it marked the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. No more radioactive fallout in the atmosphere, no more radioactive material in the ocean. Things were looking up. The limited test ban treaty was followed by further arms control agreements during the Cold War, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and the SALT I agreements of 1972. 2 years later, a threshold test ban treaty managed to further limit underground nuclear testing by constraining explosions to a maximum yield of 150 kilotons. According to the nuclear fireball calculator, that meant explosions with fireballs no more than 5.4 seconds long and a burst height of 1,022 meters. These piecemeal measures were touted as a success. The agreements were not only ecologically sound, they brought the two sides into dialogue, a helpful tool when you're trying to manage a major rivalry which could at any second endanger the survival of the entire human race. They restricted the number of nuclear missile silos and submarine-launched missile tubes. They helped keep hundreds of non-nuclear signatories, non-nuclear. And they established hotlines between the two countries which came in handy during the period of détente in the 1970s. The problem was that they never fully got over the line. They could not lead the superpowers into general disarmament, the ultimate aim of nuclear arms control after all. Both superpowers remained hell-bent on achieving nuclear superiority over the other after the treaties at almost any cost. It was the best way to maintain one's killer edge during the Cold War. This meant the development of newer, deadlier delivery systems and launch platforms, including strategic bombers and better nuclear submarines, whose testing and use were still largely unregulated. These issues were supposed to be addressed at the SALT II agreements, but before it could pass, tensions once again overshadowed negotiations. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, no surprise there, and the Carter administration responded by funding Mujahideen resistance, also no surprise, pulling out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and putting a general freeze on the SALT II negotiations. Then followed the well-known Reaganite reforms, a sweeping military modernization program which again turned the Cold War on its head and rekindled tension between the two powers. In turn, NATO began deploying advanced Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, more than capable of striking key targets in Russia, causing widespread anti-nuclear protests throughout Europe. Doubling down, Reagan resists appeasement to the Soviet Union, labeling it the evil empire. He sponsors the Strategic Defensive Initiative, SDI, a space-based ballistic missile shield that could protect against a Soviet nuclear attack. The Soviets, overwhelmed by economic setbacks, grow increasingly wary of a widening technological gap with the West. And then Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan became Well, frenemies, I guess. At a short-notice summit in Iceland in 1986, they agreed to virtually abolish their nuclear arsenals over the next 10 years. But the Soviets, irritated with the Americans' disregard of a pre-existing treaty limiting the testing required to pursue the SDI, blocked the passage of any agreement at Reykjavik. It took 5 long years to get anything across the line, but after agreeing to a joint US-Soviet program to research underground test detection in December 1987, in 1991, the two returned to center stage and passed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, which basically did away with ground-launched mid-range nuclear missiles. It's the first agreement to reduce nuclear arms, as opposed to settling ceilings, and it introduced comprehensive verification measures, an important turning point for the negotiations to come. So by the time you get to the end of the Cold War, you have accelerating US-Soviet disarmament talks and a general spirit of optimism pervading their old Cold War stomping grounds. The 1990 START Treaty managed to reduce each side's massive arsenal of more than 10,000 warheads to less than 6,000 by 2009. They were increasingly inspecting each other's underground testing facilities and capabilities, and there was hopes the world might be able to come to some sort of overarching agreement on nuclear disarmament. Then things sort of got complicated. Conditions to pursue a long-term comprehensive test ban were ripe in the mid-1990s. In 1993, the United Nations initiated negotiations. It took 3 years to thrash out a viable treaty draft. And while in 1996 the United States General Assembly managed to adopt the CTBT with 71 signatories, a number which has grown to 177 by November 2023, 3 of the 8 nuclear-capable states signed but never ratified the treaty. And that's where we get into Putin's alleged rationale for backing Russia out of its own ratification of the treaty. You see, while Russia was among the 5 nuclear-capable states at the time to ratify the CTBT in 1996, the United States wasn't. This put them in, well, shall we say, interesting company. Joining them are India, North Korea, China, Iran, Egypt, Israel, and Pakistan. Lacking the signature of the lone global superpower, the treaty was seen as more of a guideline than anything binding. While much of the world has maintained the CTBT's ban on nuclear explosions, it hasn't stopped rogue states like North Korea from experimenting from time to time. So why didn't the United States ratify the CTBT? Wasn't it in their best interest? Well, they certainly tried. In order to ratify the treaty, the United States had to pass it through the Senate first. Maybe you're getting Wilsonian flashbacks of the failed bid to approve American participation in the League of Nations after World War I, and it was a similar sort of outcome here too. Senate Republicans delayed bringing the CTBT to a vote for 3 years until July 1999, when all 45 Senate Democrats signed a letter demanding that it receive a hearing and a vote. The Republicans predictably ignored them. It took a threat from Democratic Senator Byron Dorgan to impede all Senate business until it was brought to vote to get the desired result. And so it went to a vote. Senate Republicans weren't too scared. They felt they had all the votes they needed to block the CTBT, so they agreed immediately. This took Senate Democrats and the White House off guard, making provisions for 18 hours of debate under the agreement that both parties would only be able to introduce a single amendment to the bill. Senate Democrats further inflamed their Republican peers by hobbling their ability to bring up various concerns they might have had about the bill. They, in turn, basically sabotaged the bill so that it would not pass. When it went to a vote, the ratification of the CTBT was defeated 51-48. The Republicans weren't acting out of sheer spite, though it may seem like that. They had several primary concerns that prevented them from fully supporting ratification. Foremost among them, they feared the US simply could not maintain a reliable nuclear arsenal, the bedrock of its deterrence against revisionist superpowers like Russia and China today, without the provision of future testing. Second, they rightly lacked confidence that foreign cheaters could be adequately detected. Measures were adopted after the signing of the treaty aimed at promoting the safety and reliability of American nuclear tests. They stopped underground testing, shifting their focus to maintaining the arsenals they currently possessed. Among them was the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which enabled the US to continue testing its nuclear arsenal, the last warhead having been constructed in 1992, in tightly managed facilities capable of replicating heat and pressure conditions when a nuclear weapon is detonated, but without the actual blast itself. Since the youngest American nuke is actually at least 30 years old, mitigating risk of failure is a real concern. The US has not tested nuclear weapons since 1992, which leaves the task of its stockpile maintenance to the use of simulations, using non-nuclear explosive tests and supercomputers among other methods, and other science-based solutions. Maintaining America's nuclear credibility is therefore a complex, expensive, and daunting task, one for which it is dependent on continued testing if it's to preserve its existing stockpiles without having to resort to building more. Still, since 1996, the directors of the National Nuclear Laboratory and the Commander of Strategic Command, responsible for the nation's nuclear deterrent, have both had to annually certify their confidence in America's nuclear reliability, and since then, both have claimed there is little need for further testing, casting doubt over the failure to ratify the CTBT. Doubts over cheating are also questionable. The CTBT maintains its own UN-sponsored global monitoring system, paid for and maintained by all partner nations. With almost 300 surveillance stations across the world, the monitoring system can detect a nuclear test with a yield as low as 1 kiloton. Several American agencies, including the National Academy of Sciences, have expressed satisfaction with this monitoring system, claiming it can even detect a 0.1 to 0.2 kiloton explosion. As pronounced as they were in the mid-1990s, by 2016, concerns over cheating no longer held sway as Republicans continued to resist ratification of the treaty. Failure to back the CTBT has damaged US credibility on the global stage. Today, Russia is using that failure as fuel for its own decision to revoke its ratification of the treaty. There's never a good time to back out of nuclear arms treaties, but especially today when Russian state stability has never been in greater doubt, when its ties to other revisionist and experimental nuclear powers like Iran are being increasingly strengthened, and as their disregard for the liberal international order grows. Iran is believed to have enriched uranium to 86%, after President Donald Trump revoked the Iranian nuclear deal. Many fear a test could occur at any time. Even more damaging, Iran could skip the testing process and covertly build out its own nuclear arsenal under the noses of the world's major powers, and before they could do much to stop it. Needless to say, this would be a calamity of the first order. Escalating tensions with Iran's regional adversaries, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who have promised to pursue nuclear programs of their own if Iran succeeds. Peace is always fleeting in the Middle East, but it becomes almost unimaginable if any power in that region gains access to a nuclear warhead. Further east, Pakistan and India are enveloped in age-old tensions of their own. Border skirmishes continue. It wouldn't take much for either side to return to nuclear tests as a way of intimidating the other. Signing into law the withdrawal of its ratification of the CTBT, Russian politicians claim the decision was made in their own self-interest, and in their words, as a mirror response to the actions of the United States. The claims fall short of credibility, especially as nuclear threats and active violations of neighbors' territorial sovereignty have gone hand in hand over the past few years. It's all rhetoric. Russia knows it cannot resort to nuclear weapons because it knows it cannot handle the consequences. It would jeopardize its alliance with China. It would further galvanize the West. It would put its entire population at risk. Not that that last part matters much to Putin. You probably remember when Putin and his lackeys started threatening to rain down tactical nuclear destruction on the Ukrainian battlefield. Well, the United States didn't take kindly to that. They immediately initiated a back-channel conversation with Russia's defense minister, and almost miraculously, the threats ceased shortly thereafter. It's impossible to know what they said, but it shed light on one of Putin's few remaining cards: his repeated attempts to bully the West into inaction and limit Western intervention by threatening to put his nuclear forces on high alert. The announcement threw the Western media into a frenzy, but of course achieved little of its true intended effect. No matter what Putin says, Western nuclear weapons will continuously remain in a state of high alert, and barring an actual nuclear strike, the West will continue to ferry weapons and aid into Ukraine. Perhaps thinking his threats did not go far enough, Putin then thought it would be a good idea to move some of his nuclear weapons into Belarus. Again, this was just a ploy to stoke Western fears. What it really achieved was bringing Russian nukes into closer range of NATO's rapid response and first strike forces, and conferred virtually no advantage in targeting NATO cities or bases, besides shaving a minute off their flight time. Really, this renewed threat only brought down more pressure on the shaky Lukashenko government in Belarus and brought them into closer proximity to Russian mercenary groups which had traditionally operated out of that region. Putin remains a master strategist. In light of past threats, Russia's departure from the CTBT may indeed be another failed attempt at fearmongering. The scope and extent of Russia's ability to conduct its own nuclear tests are relatively unknown, but it's likely they are not as clear-cut as Putin would hope. Like the US, Putin must navigate significant legal hurdles to do so. In light of the hundreds of millions of rubles being sunk into the war in Ukraine, it's unlikely Putin's autocratic regime even possesses the financial resources required to greenlight modern testing or produce additional nuclear weapons, a process which not only includes the purchasing of the bomb itself, but the purchase and maintenance of delivery systems, equipment, personnel, and secure renovated facilities. The world would almost certainly apply even greater economic pressure if a test were detected. What's more, ex-Soviet citizens living near old test ranges simply don't want them to resume. It's true that a nuclear test might signal to the West what idle threats cannot: Putin's commitment to putting his money where his mouth is. After announcing its intention to reverse its ratification of the CTBT, just recently Russia announced a successful submarine test launch of one of its Bulava intercontinental ballistic missiles expressly designed to deliver a nuclear warhead to a target. There was obviously no warhead attached, but such public displays fall into the category of threat we've all grown accustomed to. Russia's accompanying withdrawal from the CTBT only heightens global insecurity and lends such threats marginally more weight. NATO has pledged not to be deterred by nuclear blackmail and vowed to increase support of Ukraine in light of such provocations. But the nuclear slope is a slippery one. The West must stand resolutely opposed to nuclear blackmail and terrorism. If Putin gets his way, the rest of the world feel emboldened to disregard the types of collaborative treaties that have helped keep nuclear warheads out of combat since 1945. Even likelier, random tests and shows of force could backfire on Putin. Would anyone really be surprised if news comes out that an ex-Soviet warhead randomly detonated in an unreliable silo? Or if a threat to nuke Ukraine somehow went awry and they accidentally nuked themselves? Putin is running a real risk of alienating those few nations from which he still somehow enjoys support. The world has not forgotten the terror of the Cold War. Everyone on the planet knows that a nuclear exchange will have severe ramifications even in the most remote areas. After so much bloodshed, instability, and uncertainty, Putin launching a nuke on Ukraine, mishandling a nuclear test, or creating a nuclear disaster in his own country could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. While the United States presses forward developing cutting-edge testing methods which can simulate and study the final stages of a nuclear weapon implosion short of an actual detonation, giving them accurate insight on how its 30-year-old weapons will operate and when it's time to replace them, Russia will resort to the cheaper and far more destabilizing option. Where that leads is anyone's guess, but it won't be anywhere good. But what do you think? Is Putin starting a nuclear war an actual risk, or will sanity prevail even when, and we do believe it's when, not if, he is ultimately defeated in the Ukraine conflict? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Kidnapping nuclear power plant officials, forcing Ukrainian staff to work at gunpoint, secretly placing explosives inside the plant, and possibly creating a nuclear catastrophe. Only a complete maniac would resort to such extreme measures with potentially apocalyptic consequences in order to win a war, and we're pretty sure you know who we're talking about. In recent weeks, the war in Ukraine has taken yet another frightening turn, one which shows just how desperate Putin has gotten. The newest developments are based around the Zaporizhzhia power plant. Located in Ukraine's southeast on the bank of the Dnipro River, Zaporizhzhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, and has become a serious concern since Russia's invasion commenced. In early March of last year, Russian troops stormed and took control of the plant, where they kidnapped 2 top Ukrainian energy company officials. Despite the Russian occupation, the plant has continued to be run by Ukrainian staff, forced to work at gunpoint. It has also suffered numerous dangerous power outages and even taken damage from shelling by Russian forces. But now things at Zaporizhzhia have become even more dire. especially after the destruction of the nearby Kakhovka Dam, which independent investigations have linked to Russia. In recent days, Ukrainian officials have warned that Putin plans to do the same thing to the power plant, using explosive charges laid somewhere inside and potentially creating a nuclear disaster. But just how credible are these threats by Putin's regime? And if Zaporizhzhia is sabotaged, what will it mean for Ukraine, Russia, and the future of the war? Before diving into these questions, let's take a quick look at the dramatic history of the plant. The city of Zaporizhzhia, which sits about 60 miles north of the power plant, was originally founded in 1770 to protect the southern territories of the Russian Empire from invasion by the Crimean Tatars. But as Russia expanded, the city lost its strategic significance and became a small, rural town until the start of the 20th century. But following the Russian Revolution, Zaporizhzhia quickly industrialized. As the Soviets built the Dnipro hydroelectric station, the Zaporizhzhia steel plant, and the Dnipro aluminium plant, the city also came to play a key role in World War II, becoming the scene of intense fighting between the USSR and Nazi Germany, as well as a temporary Nazi headquarters. To stop German advances, the Red Army eventually blew an enormous hole in the nearby Dnipro hydroelectric dam in 1941, producing a flood wave that swept from Zaporizhzhia to nearby Nikopol. The flood killed local residents as well as soldiers from both armies, with historians estimating the death toll to be between 20,000 and 100,000. When the war ended, the city and its surrounding industries were eventually returned to Soviet control, setting up the plant's modern significance. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was constructed throughout the 1980s. It has 6 VVER-1000-style pressurized light water nuclear reactors, each fueled with enriched uranium-235. The first 5 were successfully brought online between 1985 and 1989, while the 6th was added several years later. When Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the power plant became the property of the new country. It operated smoothly during the early 21st century, but became a place of concern following Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and aggression in the Donbass region. Shelling soon took place very close to the plant, and its operations were interrupted several times, leading to rolling blackouts across the region. Even today, Ukraine gets about half of its electricity from 15 nuclear reactors at 4 plants across the country, according to the World Nuclear Association. Zaporizhzhia alone provided almost half of Ukraine's nuclear power, until the service disruptions began as a result of Russia's invasion. And while shelling has repeatedly damaged the plant since the full-scale invasion began last year, so far it has not resulted in a nuclear disaster. But that could change very quickly. Warnings by Ukrainian and international officials have become more dire since Russia allegedly blew up the nearby Kakhovka Dam and hydroelectric power plant on June 6th, with many claiming the same could be done at Zaporizhzhia. The nuclear plant also relies on water from the reservoir to provide power for its turbine condensers, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Things escalated further in early July, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that Ukrainian intelligence had information that Russian troops have placed explosives on the roof of the Zaporizhzhia plant. This set off alarm bells around the world, since the last nuclear incident to take place on Ukrainian soil, the infamous 1986 Chernobyl disaster, is widely regarded as the worst in history. But even at Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster was accidental. There has never before been a case of an invading country weaponizing a nuclear power plant and using it as a hostage threat in the way Putin has been doing with Zaporizhzhia. Nor has there ever been such a large nuclear plant so squarely in the middle of a war zone, which has complicated efforts to safeguard the reactors. Luckily, after the explosion at the Kakhovka Dam, the last of Zaporizhzhia's 6 reactors was put into cold shutdown. In this state, all control rods are inserted into the reactor core to stop the nuclear fission reaction and generation of heat and pressure. This greatly reduced the chances of a nuclear meltdown on the scale of Chernobyl, even if things around the plant are far from safe. William Albuck, the Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has said that we're actually very, very lucky. Any incident would not involve an active reactor, which could cause enormous environmental danger and damage and deaths. At the same time, Albuck also said the warnings from Ukrainian officials should be taken very seriously, since any time Ukraine and the US think that a false flag attack is going to happen, they talk about it early, often and loudly. And this is, I think, an attempt to deter Russia from doing something that they're concerned may happen. So why would Putin do something as seemingly insane as blowing up a nuclear power plant, most likely as a sort of very scary deterrent for the West. Damage to Europe's largest nuclear power plant is just the sort of incident that would scare the hell out of the international coalition supporting Ukraine, and it would show that Putin is serious, without resorting to the use of an actual nuclear weapon, sending fallout back towards Moscow. And the fact that he is seemingly willing to engage in such a desperate high-stakes gamble shows just how badly the invasion has gone. With the short-lived rebellion of the Wagner Group PMC earlier in July, Putin is facing serious questions from even his most hardcore supporters. An explosion at Zaporizhzhia could easily be turned into a false flag, with Putin blaming Ukraine and claiming that as justification to continue the war effort. There are also huge economic stakes surrounding the plant's control and operations. Each of Zaporizhzhia's reactors would cost $7 billion to replace. These enormous sums means Russia likely doesn't want to actually destroy any of the reactors. Instead, Putin probably hopes to use the plant later to serve Russia's own electricity market, according to analysis by defense and security intelligence firm Janes. Should Russia keep control of the plant, Ukraine would lose up to 20% of its domestic electricity generating capacity. This also makes its future operations a huge strategic bargaining chip, one which would come into play later this year. And according to Al Burke, there are 4 possible ways Russia could be planning to attack the plant. They could blow up the dry fuel storage, blow up the wet fuel storage, blow up one of the reactor buildings itself, or try to melt the nuclear fuel that's still in the reactor. Each of these could play out slightly differently. If Russia strikes the plant from outside and claims that Ukraine did it, they will be striking the heavily reinforced 4-foot-thick concrete walls. Unlike the Chernobyl-style RBMK reactors, Zaporizhzhia is much more solid, and it would require a huge amount of weaponry to break through the outside of a building. Even so, none of the possibilities are very good. The least dangerous of the 4 scenarios would be blowing up the dry fuel storage. The main impact of this type of attack would be on people in the direct downwind, who would have an increased risk of cancer in their lifetime. Even without a true Chernobyl-style disaster, this could potentially affect tens of thousands and would be very difficult to counteract in the middle of an open war zone. Other possibilities are even more unpleasant to consider. The most dangerous scenario would be to blow up the reactor vessel inside the building itself. This would be similar to what Russia did when it blew up the Kakhovka Dam. While it would not involve opening a live reactor, like occurred at Chernobyl, it would still involve burning nuclear fuel, which could potentially melt through the floor, as happened in Japan in 2011. Because the reactors are in cold shutdown, the risk of a true catastrophe is greatly reduced. As Alberg pointed out, none of these scenarios rise to the level of a Fukushima or Chernobyl unless they blow it up right from the inside, and they guard it to make sure that no one can do anything about it for a couple of weeks, and the fuel builds up and then explodes. With the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) on site, this is pretty unlikely. Alberg said that the IAEA is monitoring the reactors very closely, so it would be hard to plan such an explosion from inside without IAEA's team seeing it. But that might not stop Putin. Ukrainian intelligence and satellite imagery have confirmed the presence of multiple unknown objects on the top of the building, which may or may not be explosives. The IAEA also can't be totally sure about any of this, as their team has requested access to the roof of the building and other at-risk areas, but has so far been unable to verify either way. Let's say Putin actually pulls off an explosion at Zaporizhzhia. How much damage could it do to Ukraine? According to some experts, while it would certainly be bad, the effects of an explosion would also be limited. The immediate death toll of such an event would probably be lower than the floods unleashed by the Kakhovka Dam, which killed over 100 people and left close to 1 million without clean drinking water. Similarly, the environmental impact of an explosion at Zaporizhzhia would not be as severe as that of the flooding, which ruined local ecosystems, killed more than 20,000 domesticated animals, and ruined hundreds of acres of Ukrainian farmland. Overall, the flood caused an estimated $1.3 billion worth of damage. The American Nuclear Society has published similar findings, saying that the reactors being shut down has greatly limited the risk of fallout from an explosion. They determined that in the worst-case scenario, it is unlikely that there would be enough radiation released to threaten public safety, even in the case of deliberate sabotage of the reactors and spent fuel storage canisters. In the event that the massive concrete structures could even be breached, the reactor shutdowns would limit radiation damage to the area surrounding the plant. While this is clearly good news for the European public, it's not much reassurance to the Ukrainians with homes nearby the plant. Alberg and others have admitted that anyone living within 20 miles of the reactor would still be at risk. And there is also disagreement among experts as to the wider risk from a damaged plant. Nuclear physicist Ed Lyman recently wrote that the American Nuclear Society was dead wrong about the level of risk. He has argued that the reactor shutdown just means operators will have more time to respond to a potential incident. Hopefully that means they can fix any damage before the cooling water in the reactor cores boils away, exposing the fuel assemblies and causing them to overheat. Lyman also notes that even in shutdown mode, there are still a range of things that could go wrong inside the reactor, such as a reduction in the levels of boron in the cooling water, creating short-lived but still toxic fission products, such as iodine isotopes. It's also extremely rare for reactors to be maintained long-term in either hot or cold shutdown modes, with fuel still remaining in the core. Because it happens so rarely, there is limited data and an increased risk of malfunction. As he ominously puts it, unfortunately, because of the incredible stress that the greatly reduced staff at Zaporizhzhia are under, and the unclear lines of command under Russian occupation, their ability to efficiently execute all the actions necessary to mitigate any accident or sabotage attack is in grave doubt. Essentially, even with all 6 reactors in cold shutdown, there's a whole lot of things that could go wrong. All of this casts some doubt on the idea of limited fallout, especially if the war drags on for an extended period of time, with the plant's status remaining uncertain. These possibilities are still concerning enough. The Ukrainian authorities recently conducted emergency drills nearby. The city of Zaporizhzhia is about 62 miles north of the power plant, far enough to limit instant exposure, but still far too close for comfort. So at the end of June 2023, hundreds of Ukrainian emergency workers put on hazmat suits and got to work. They scoured the city and nearby villages with radiation detectors and have been passing out iodine tablets to residents for months. During the recent drills, they also set up a tent to provide first aid, with emergency workers practicing hosing people down with soap and going through the fake process of administering treatment to individuals who play-acted victims from possible radiation-affected areas. This type of contingency planning shows real concerns, especially since the procedures for containment would be far more difficult in an active combat zone. Should something happen at the plant, the people will be brought from radiation-contaminated areas to a location upwind, where they will be given medical and psychological assistance. The next stop would be a temporary holding center, where people would be washed to wipe away surface radiation and then transported to evacuation points and hospitals. According to the emergency services, in case of a nuclear disaster at the plant, approximately 300,000 people would need to be evacuated from the areas closest to the facility. That covers 4 regions: Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Mykolaiv. The evacuation would be mandatory and require massive logistics coordination. According to the Ukrainian government, people will be allowed to bring their pets with them, while buses, trains, and personal cars would be used for the evacuation from the affected zone. Residents in the area have also been preparing for any possibility. Local Larissa Mikolaeva told ABC that, "We need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best." She added that while the drill made her anxious, she understands why it's being done. Her family, like many others, has already stocked up on large bottles of drinking water, stored food supplies, and purchased masks to prepare for possible disaster. In the nearby areas controlled by Russia, similar preparations have been undertaken in the last few weeks. Russian-installed government officials said they had evacuated 1,600 people, including 660 children, from the area directly around the plant. There are also potential issues of who could or would get civilians to safety and clean up the damage from an explosion. Zaporizhzhia sits very close to the front line, one which could change quickly depending on the success of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Because of this, the ownership and control over the plant is likely to remain disputed in the short term, and it's unclear how or if Ukrainian and Russian occupation authorities would coordinate a disaster response. According to the United Nations, nuclear safety is the responsibility of every nation that utilizes nuclear technology, but there is no rulebook for nuclear safety in a war zone. Since its occupation of the plant began in March last year, Russia has designated it federal property, creating a state-run company to oversee its operation, and given it a pathetically small 500,000 rubles for funding, the equivalent of $6,500. But despite these actions, the plant and territory legally belongs to Ukraine, a position supported by both international law and most countries in the world. So far, this situation has led to the IAEA acting as a de facto mediator between the two countries, while attempting to ensure that the plant itself does not suffer damage. But if Putin decides to act on his plan to damage Zaporizhzhia with explosives, this uneasy status quo could change in an instant. At that point, it's anyone's guess whether Russia, Ukraine, or both would attempt to maintain control of the plant and secure the nearby population. So what does the current situation at Zaporizhzhia mean for the future of the war? For one thing, it's a pretty clear sign that Putin will not stop playing the politics of fear. By setting up the possibility of a false flag attack, he has essentially admitted that regular military strategy is failing him. Considering how relatively close the plant is to Moscow, it seems as though he is somewhat confident that the fallout would be limited, or only irradiate areas inside Ukraine. The natural conclusion is that he is not going for damage but instead for sheer terror, to try and regain his footing in a losing conflict. Perhaps he hopes that the threat of extreme measures will get Russian hardliners behind him once again, or that fear of nuclear fallout will cause the West to question its support for Ukraine. Whatever his desired outcome here, it's yet another display of a callous leader, one more like a mafia thug than the president of a great power. This also raises a final question. How should the international community go about dealing with Zaporizhzhia? Experts have come up with a number of strategies, mostly involving neutral peacekeepers who can oversee the plant's operations and ensure that it isn't used as a nuclear bargaining chip again. The most probable option for this is a demilitarized zone around the plant, but this would involve some sort of agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't look very likely in the near future. Any outcome will also depend heavily on the success or failure of Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive, since it will determine who ultimately has control of the plant's day-to-day operations. Given the enormous amount of energy it has provided to Ukraine in the past, the government in Kyiv will almost certainly try to retake and keep control of the plant. As always, it's very hard to know what the future will bring, but one way or another, Zaporizhzhia is likely to be a major part of the war's second year. But what do you think? Will Putin really set off explosives at the nuclear power plant, or is he just bluffing? And if not, what does this mean for the future of the war? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. In the summer of 2021, China sparked great alarm in Washington when it tested hypersonic missiles. Some in the United States even feared that this test was another Sputnik moment. General Mark Milley, chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, denied that the test was a Sputnik equivalent, but said it was very close to that. How real is this fear? What does the nuclear balance of power between the United States and China look like? If the unthinkable happened, what could a nuclear confrontation between the two look like? Let's begin. China has grown immensely wealthy over the last few decades, especially since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Beijing has used large portions of its enriched coffers in the drive to create a world-class military capable of competing with the United States. China's naval and air capabilities have increased enormously, but Beijing is now keen to share the love with its nuclear forces as well. China was one of the recognized powers in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which went into effect in 1970. However, it had always had a limited nuclear capability compared to the true nuclear superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. It had few ways of delivering nuclear weapons beyond ICBM launchers and silos, and had a small number of active warheads. That has begun to change at a rapid pace in the last couple of years. In 2020, the United States estimated that China had a little more than 200 nuclear warheads. By the end of 2022, however, China had doubled that number. If Beijing continues its nuclear buildup at this pace, it could have about 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. However, China is not only building up the number of warheads at its disposal, but the means of delivering them. In 2021, China appeared to be building 200 new nuclear missile silos in its Gansu and Xinjiang provinces. However, China understands that these silos are easy targets, so it's also building more road-mobile ICBMs, new ballistic missile submarines, and new bomber-delivered nuclear weapons. In other words, China is trying to create an effective nuclear triad of its own in a bid to protect its nuclear capability and, if need be, enhance its offensive nuclear potential. China completed the triad with its deployment of the nuclear-capable Zhanhong 6 bomber in 2020. Meanwhile, China conducted 135 ballistic missile tests in 2021, more than every other country in the world combined. The biggest buzz, though, went to its hypersonic test that summer. The July 2021 test featured a hypersonic missile that encircled the world before hitting its target. It flew for a total of 40,000 kilometers, the longest flight of any Chinese land attack weapon on record. At this point, it's always important to clear away some of the cobwebs. Hypersonic missiles, projectiles capable of exceeding Mach 5, are not new. Traditional ICBMs have long exceeded these speeds. What would make China's 2021 weapon new is its combination of a fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBS, with a hypersonic glide vehicle, HGV. A FOBS works by flying into low Earth orbit to an altitude of about 240 kilometers. This allows the device to remain below the line of sight of radar systems designed to pick up the arc of traditional ballistic missiles. Then, before completing a full orbit, the FOBS turns around and performs a retrograde engine burn, slowing its speed so that it will intersect with its designated target. The end result is that a FOBS can strike from an unexpected direction. For example, a missile launched to low orbit over Antarctica can turn around and hit Alaska. The Soviet Union experimented with these systems in the 1970s, but work on FOBS was abandoned after the SALT II treaty banned them, and Soviet submarines became more capable of launching ballistic missiles. China is interested in picking up where the Soviet Union left off, however. Beijing partially sees this as a necessity, thanks to greater American investment in missile defense systems following its withdrawal from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. The second component of the system, the HGV, makes the FOBS even more unpredictable. Glide vehicles differ from traditional weapons in how they move toward their targets. Traditional ballistic missiles come at a fast but predictable arc. HGVs ride up to orbit, descend, and glide through the atmosphere to reach their targets. An HGV is able to maneuver, roll, or even pull up on re-entry to re-exit the atmosphere and then enter it again. Through these devices, an HGV can alter its trajectory while maintaining hypersonic velocities, making it fast and hard for missile defense systems to predict. China claimed that this test was of a space plane, not a weapons system, but this was a clever response. It exposes the overlap between space vehicles and these types of weapon systems. The hypersonic missile missed its target by about 24 miles. This is of little comfort if such a weapon were to carry a strategic nuclear warhead, however. The test also raised alarms about an intelligence failure, as US officials realized that China's advancement in hypersonic weapons was further along than they once thought. Potentially, China could send this new weapon on a trajectory over the South Pole. The weapon could then turn around and glide towards American targets, because American missile defense systems are focused on trajectories over the North Pole, which is the route that Soviet ballistic missiles would have taken during the Cold War. The new Chinese weapon would leave the United States particularly vulnerable. China's moves are intended to even the playing field in a dangerous game where it had long lagged behind. The United States has the world's second largest nuclear arsenal with 5,224 warheads. The United States currently deploys some of its nuclear weapons to 5 other nations: Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The forward deployment reduces the risk that America's ability for nuclear retaliation will be wiped out in an enemy-first strike. It also gives the United States greater ability to launch nuclear attacks of its own. American nuclear warheads were once deployed to Japan and South Korea but have since been removed. If nuclear tensions were to escalate with China, it's probable the United States would redeploy those weapons there, something the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe suggested could be a necessity given the current situation in the region, although he only made this suggestion after his premiership had concluded. The United States is regarded as being behind China and Russia in the deployment of hypersonic technology. There have also been major alarms about the state of America's nuclear triad in the last decade. Most of the weapons and delivery systems are many decades old. For example, the land-based part of the nuclear triad consists of about 400 LGM-30G Minuteman III missiles. This weapon system began development in 1964 and entered service in 1970. It's currently the only land-based ICBM in the United States military, and the Air Force plans to use it into the 2030s. Some of the United States land-based ICBM systems are so old that until 2019 they used 1970s-era floppy disks as part of the command and control system. Other parts of the IT system are as old. While this has the advantage of not being vulnerable to cyber warfare, it also means the system is expensive to maintain, as modern engineers are unfamiliar with it, and the Air Force has increasingly needed to rely on costly civilian specialists to maintain the old architecture. The United States maintains a significant lead over China in the realm of submarine warfare. However, its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines are also old, with their plans originating in the 1970s, and the first vessels being launched in the early 1980s. Meanwhile, the United States has only 20 active bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Its fleet of B-1 and B-52 bombers were once capable of doing this, but were altered to be conventional only in the 1990s. But these weapons platforms are also old anyway. In recent years, the United States has acknowledged that it allowed its nuclear capability to atrophy following the end of the Cold War. During the Obama administration, the United States made plans to modernize the nuclear triad, which took more concrete shape during the Trump administration. It consisted of a $1.2 trillion plan between 2017 and 2046, including $772 billion for the modernization of strategic nuclear delivery systems, $25 billion for tactical nuclear delivery systems, and $445 billion for facilities needed for the operation of the new nuclear triad. One of the primary weapons in this new arsenal will be the Minuteman III's successor, the LGM-35 Sentinel, which the Air Force plans to have ready by 2030. The Sentinel will come with new silos and a new command and control system. The United States is also working on a replacement for the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. This will be the Columbia-class submarine, set to launch in 2031, with 12 of the new vessels planned for construction. So important is this goal that the Navy has identified the Columbia-class submarine as its top priority program, a nod to how vital the US submarine fleet is to deterring China's ambitions. Each Columbia-class submarine will be able to carry up to 16 Trident D5 missiles, each of which can potentially carry 12 Mark IV re-entry vehicles. Although the United States has phased out these multiple re-entry vehicles on its nuclear ballistic missile since 2014 to comply with the New START treaty with Russia, the missiles can be re-equipped with them if the need arises. China is not a member of the New START treaty. Finally, there is the coming B-21 Raider bomber, which is set to replace both the B-1 Lancer and the B-2 Spirit. The Raider was rolled out to photographers for the first time in December 22, and is scheduled to enter service in 2027 with a maiden flight expected in the remaining months of 2023. The Air Force plans to purchase up to 145 B-21s, depending on the plane's engineering and manufacturing development. As the successor of the B-2, the B-21 will be capable of delivering nuclear weapons like the B-61 and B-83 bombs. The United States has also been trying its best to catch up in the hypersonic missile race, and may have closed the gap. In October 2022, the United States launched a test of several hypersonic missile components. These included communications and navigations equipment and a glide vehicle that can withstand the friction generated by moving at hypersonic velocities. The test was designed to validate aspects of the Navy's conventional prompt strike and the Army's long-range hypersonic weapons program. The Pentagon considered the tests a success. For now, these programs are only experiments, and the Pentagon has still not made a formal decision to acquire hypersonic weapons, according to the Congressional Research Service. Still, the Defense Department spent $4.7 billion on hypersonic weapons research in fiscal year 2023, up from $3.8 billion in fiscal year 2022. Adding these weapons to the United States' traditional nuclear arsenal seems inevitable. How might nuclear war break out? China officially has a no-first-use policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, even if its nuclear forces are attacked by conventional enemy forces. Only in the case of a nuclear weapons strike, officially, would China use its own nukes to retaliate. This policy started with its first nuclear test in 1964, when China declared it will never at any time or under any circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. This policy was reaffirmed in a classified Chinese document for the operators of China's nuclear forces, where it put repeat reminders about its no-first-use policy. However, there is skepticism in Washington. The document, called The Science of Second Artillery Operations, has a section concerning what Chinese nuclear forces should do if a strong military power possessing nuclear-armed missiles and an absolute advantage in high-tech conventional weapons is carrying out intense and continuous attacks against our major strategic targets, and we have no good military strategy to resist the enemy. This strong military power is clearly the United States. The document suggests that Chinese nuclear forces should lower the threshold in this scenario and put its nuclear weapons on alert. This is an important distinction, because unlike the United States, China's policy has been to keep its nuclear forces off alert. Its warheads are not mated to its ICBMs, and its nuclear-armed submarines are not on continuous patrol at sea. This suggests that China takes its no-first-use policy seriously. By putting its nuclear forces on alert, China would hope to deter the United States from taking further military action and to not use its nuclear weapons in a potential first strike. which may be tempting as military tensions escalate, given the still small size of China's nuclear arsenal in comparison to that of the United States. However, the document's addition of the notion that China could use nuclear threats to compel the United States to stop a conventional attack made Dr. Gregory Kalaki, the China project manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, uneasy. The use of nuclear threats to stop a conventional attack can slip into escalation if conventional fighting breaks out. Within the confined and disputed waters of the South China Sea, there are many places where this can happen. It would not necessarily take something as dramatic as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. An accidental encounter in the South China Sea, such as during one of the United States Freedom of Navigation operations, FONOPs, could be the trigger to a broader conflict via miscalculation. Close military calls between the United States and Chinese armed forces have happened during these FONOPs before, as China becomes more and more aggressive in asserting its territorial claims in the area, claims that the United States does not recognize. Suppose it's the year 2031. The United States and China are at a standoff over an attempted blockade of the South China Sea's shipping lanes to Taiwan or another American ally in the region. A FONOP leads to a protracted firefight between vessels of the United States Navy and the PLAN. If conventional conflict escalates enough, or if China's leaders consider themselves threatened enough, nuclear readiness of the like Dr. Kalaki suggested could cause further tensions and make one of the two sides believe that the other is going nuclear. For the United States, the threshold for a nuclear strike is lower than one would believe. It does not have a no first-use policy. Authorization to use nuclear weapons can only come from the president. Critics suggest that this should be changed and that further restraints should be placed on the president. But for now, the president can authorize a nuclear strike at any time and for any reason. The only limitation to this authority would be under the laws of armed conflict. For example, if the attack would cause unnecessary humanitarian suffering, or if the attack's target is not a military necessity, the order could be disregarded. However, even in these circumstances, it's likely only that the order would be changed rather than halted. So if the president believes that China will disregard its no first-use policy and resort to nuclear weapons in order to stop a conventional conflict between it and the United States, American nuclear weapons may take to the skies. Once conventional pressures heat up, the impetus to respond and create a nuclear first strike could become acute if the United States believes its missile defense systems will be overwhelmed, or if China believes that it will lose its ability to retaliate thanks to its relatively small nuclear arsenal. Preventing this from happening would require seemingly trustworthy communication between two sides that have already been shooting at each other. How might a nuclear war go? Even with its aging triad, the current nuclear balance of power favors the United States, especially beneath the waves. The United States currently has 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Each can carry up to 20 nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles. Some of these are deployed to the contested waters in the Indo-Pacific region. If a nuclear confrontation were to break out with China, the submarines would give the United States its greatest advantage. China is far behind the United States when it comes to underwater warfare. Detecting America's nuclear-powered submarines is a tall order for China's People's Liberation Army Navy. In a nuclear confrontation, America's Ohio-class submarines would swing into action and attack important targets, such as China's Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island, which houses its fleet of Type 094 Jin-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. In contrast to the Ohio-class, China only has 4 of these submarines, and the United States may hope to take one or more of them off the board by striking the base. Each Type 094 can carry 12 ballistic missiles, with a range between 7,200 and 9,000 kilometers. This would be sufficient to reach the continental United States if launched from the waters near China, but would threaten all of America's bases and allies in the region, plus Alaska and Hawaii. In a nuclear scenario, it's unlikely that all of the Type 094s would be taken out at once. Although they are louder than the Cold War-era Soviet submarines, they would likely be found before they could get into range to attack the continental United States. However, China is also working on a successor ballistic missile submarine, the Type 096, which is quieter and would be armed with new missiles with a range exceeding 9,000 kilometers. The Pentagon expects the Type 096 to be operational by 2030, further adding to China's nuclear readiness. Nuclear missile silos and bases likely to host China's mobile ballistic missile launchers would also be targeted by American submarines. Some of these mobile launchers may have ballistic missiles armed with nuclear-tipped HGVs. Examples would include the medium-range DF-17, With its DF-ZF-HGV, which has a range between 1,800 and 2,500 kilometers. This weapon system became operational in 2019, and although it cannot reach the American mainland, it poses a serious threat to the United States bases and fleets in the region. The Ohio-class submarines would be hard for China to remove from the board. Dozens of nuclear, ballistic, or cruise missiles would come over Chinese airspace in an all-out attack. China has missiles capable of reaching the United States too, and America's interior nuclear bases, naval bases, and silos would come under attack. Air defense systems would destroy some of these, but any that make it through would do devastating damage, and if its hypersonic-related technology comes online, it would have greater success. Additionally, China's leaders have had a long-standing policy of targeting adversarial cities in a nuclear second strike, so even if the United States seeks to avoid civilian areas as much as possible in an attack, China probably won't. It's difficult to tell how exactly a nuclear war between the United States and China would go, except that it would be the most catastrophic confrontation ever recorded. What is clear is that China's nuclear posture is quickly changing from one of minimum deterrence to something far more offensive. The expansion in its nuclear capabilities allows China's military to be bolder in pursuing its expansionist ambitions. Before, America's nuclear superiority made it harder for China to directly challenge the international order led by the United States. That's now beginning to change, and Washington is willing to spend trillions to ensure that its biggest strategic rival does not eclipse its nuclear capability. Describing the current situation as a return to a Cold War-style nuclear arms race may be overdoing it, but one thing is certain: we are closer to that kind of confrontation than at any time since the days of the Soviet Union. What do you think about China's military buildup? How does it change the balance of power with the United States? And what would a nuclear confrontation between them look like? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Will Putin launch an attack on the USA? The possibility of a Russian attack on the US has been a top national security concern for decades. Since the earliest days of the Cold War, US policymakers have run war games and maintained preparations for a range of possible attacks. Now, with the war in Ukraine raging and US-Russia relations at their worst point in decades, it is a question which has returned to the minds of many. While such an event is still extremely unlikely to occur, it raises several hypothetical questions. What could a limited or not so limited Russian attack on US assets look like? What's our best guess at how things might play out? And what chance, if any, would Russia stand in a real war against the American military and NATO? One thing's for sure: Putin is not happy about the West repeatedly coming to Ukraine's aid in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and with Russia's army failing miserably on the battlefield, it may only be a matter of time before Putin's threats to either back off and stop helping Ukraine or face a showdown start coming in. Here's how it could go down. It's late 2023. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been raging for over a year and a half, with both sides taking enormous amounts of casualties. But armed with more and more Western firepower and training, the Ukrainian military has pushed Russian troops out of most of eastern Ukraine. Russia's mass conscription and brutal human wave tactics have not been enough, and it has lost nearly all of its conquered territory outside of Crimea. Increasingly desperate and fearing that oligarchs or commanders will soon topple him from power, Vladimir Putin decides to pull out all the stops. He threatens to do anything necessary to stop the West from further arming Ukraine and to regain Russia's historical sphere of influence, but most assume he is still bluffing. However, indications from US intelligence hint that this time it might be something more serious. Putin puts out a televised statement claiming that the US and NATO have 72 hours to begin removing their on-the-ground trainers and Patriot missile systems to halt the flow of Western weapons into the country, and if they do not, Russia reserves the right to defend itself. President Joe Biden responds, saying that the West will not back down or be intimidated by Putin. For a brief moment, everyone falls silent, but the peace doesn't last long before the storm hits. Several days pass, with continued heavy fighting in Ukraine, but no more threats. Then, suddenly, an innocent software update from the week before crashes internal servers from the White House, Department of Defense, NATO High Command, and Ukrainian armed forces, as well as more than a dozen defense-associated companies using advanced malware. At the same time, a mass-distributed denial of service or DDoS attack overwhelms secondary computer systems, flooding them with traffic and crashing them. On the malware-infected computers, a message appears demanding that the US halt its support of Ukraine or face further consequences. What now? According to experts like retired General Herbert "Hawk" Carlisle, former head of the Air Combat Command, such escalation in cyberspace would likely follow a period of heightened tensions and warnings, and in an all-out conflict, the US and NATO would have to initially counter Russian cyber capabilities. Because of advance warning from intelligence agencies, the US would most likely have the time to prepare for a physical Russian attack by increasing its combat capacity in both Europe and Alaska. But it could get darker. A conflict opening with a hostile cyber attack could come with much less warning and provide Russia with a small early advantage against vastly superior US and NATO capabilities. Alright, so Putin is officially gearing up for a fight. What comes next? As US, NATO, and Ukrainian authorities scramble to bring their essential computer systems back online, intelligence agencies begin to pick up increased activity at Russian missile launch sites on both Ukrainian and Polish borders, as well as at major military installations around Vladivostok and Kaliningrad at two ends of the country. In response to the cyber attack and troop movement, the Department of Defense moves the US to DEFCON 2. In this posture, only ever used during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the US would have the Army, Navy, and Air Force poised for combat and ready to deploy in hours. US and NATO Cyber Command then quickly mount a retaliatory cyber operation, which could involve substantial disruption of Russian communications and activation of malware attacks on critical computer systems, power grids, and military bases. But let's say Putin takes it a step further. As both Western and Russian computer systems are still recovering that same day, the Russian Air Force begins flying sorties into NATO airspace over Poland. Then, suddenly, Russian missiles fired from the border of Ukraine strike 3 air bases in Poland and Romania involved in supplying military assistance to Ukraine. Despite air defenses, there are roughly a dozen US and NATO casualties and significant damage to the base's infrastructure. Some of the missiles miss their target and hit nearby areas, killing another dozen civilians. Putin releases a statement promising further such attacks on other targets if NATO and US assistance to Ukraine does not end. Within minutes, news of the attack reaches the US president, transmitted via a network of 6 jamming-resistant satellites which provide real-time communications to the US, Canadian, Dutch, Australian, and British militaries. Let's pause for a moment to hear what military experts have to say about the likelihood of this type of event sequence. In a December 2022 paper, the RAND Corporation, the DoD's think tank, outlines 3 possible scenarios for a Russian first strike on a US or NATO target: demonstrative, focused, or less restrained. This hypothetical is their Scenario C, a focused attack, the third most severe of their 4 Russian strike possibilities. At this point, DoD and NATO leadership would have to decide whether to continue escalation and retaliate with kinetic strikes of their own, or to back down and try to defuse the situation. Because of the severity of such an attack with casualties from multiple NATO members, US and NATO leaders would almost certainly decide the attack requires retaliation in kind to satisfy NATO members' concerns about the credibility of Article 5. In short, it's time to fight back. Advised to take early action, the president calls an emergency session of Congress, which within hours passes a joint resolution authorizing the limited use of military force against Russia and its allies. The president gives a televised speech stating that the US has taken its own retaliatory actions for the unprovoked attack, but that the US response is purely defensive. US ground forces will not enter Russia, he declares, in hopes of stopping escalation to the level of full war. The US therefore decides to launch a proportional response on Russian targets in Ukraine. Even before the speech is finished, 2 US-controlled Reaper drones take off from air bases in Poland. Once over Ukrainian airspace, they strike Russian air bases and missile defenses in Crimea, killing several dozen soldiers and destroying a number of planes. At the same time, the US launches a number of modified SM-3 missiles from its ships around the world, knocking out a handful of Russian communication satellites. This strike leaves Russia with limited GPS targeting and communications capabilities. So far, so good. But while Biden and other Western leaders urge Putin to back down and not escalate things anymore, they receive no answer. Putin decides he cannot back down now. The next day, 2 MiG-31 fighter jets enter Polish airspace. Before they can be destroyed, they fire Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, managing to hit 2 NATO missile batteries and killing another half-dozen soldiers. At the same time, all gas from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is shut off, leaving millions of homes in Europe with no gas supply. By this point, escalation in Europe is nearly inevitable. NATO calls an emergency summit, and after 2 days of initial resistance from Turkey and several other states, Article 5 is officially invoked. But top NATO officials stress that their operations against Russia will be limited and purely defensive. Defensive, but powerful. With Article 5 invoked, the first priority of NATO troops is to take out Russian air defenses near Europe, before striking air bases and missile launch sites to try and stop shelling of NATO assets. So after multiple missile salvos from US submarines and aircraft carriers in the Black Sea and Mediterranean wipe out most of Russia's western surface-to-air defenses, fighter jets and long-range bombers from NATO countries begin to engage in aerial dogfights with Russian planes across Eastern Europe. The older Russian jets are quickly outmatched and outnumbered, but combined with the remaining air defenses, they are still able to take out a handful of F-15s and other NATO assets. Fighting is especially concentrated around western Poland and Kaliningrad, which NATO strikes repeatedly and declares a no-fly zone over. The massive US fleet of 650 tanker jets also takes off from North America and begins to circle the Atlantic, providing in-air refueling for more F-15s and F-16s called in from air bases in the US. American cargo planes also embark across the ocean, carrying troops, heavy vehicles, and supplies, which will be used to resupply the growing front in Eastern Europe. And this is just the beginning. At the same time, all US troops in Europe are recalled from leave to be mobilized. The US Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Italy and its 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany join NATO forces from across Europe and engage Russian troops on the borders of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. While Russia's failures in Ukraine make the prospect of them taking another national capital doubtful at best, Russian missiles and artillery begin striking towns near the border, causing immense damage to the area's infrastructure and killing dozens more civilians. More cyber attacks are also unleashed against the power grids in Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania, causing rolling blackouts. US air defenses in Poland are able to down some of the incoming missiles, but many which were fired indiscriminately still get through. Putin also orders a full-scale draft and mobilization of all young men in Russia, seeking to get cannon fodder to the front as quickly as possible. Great! More fresh-faced Russian conscripts heading to the front lines. Has Putin learned nothing from his past mistakes? Regardless, let's take a look at what's happening in Europe while all this is going on. As you can imagine, things get pretty bad. While many national leaders urge people to remain calm, commercial air and rail traffic in Eastern Europe grinds to a halt, and the stock market begins to crash, creating panic. Nord Stream gas remains cut off, and refugees fleeing the crisis also continue to move west, stoking fears of a mass humanitarian crisis across Europe. The UN continues to press for a ceasefire, but Putin says he will not back down until his demands are met, though he stops short of explicitly threatening nuclear action. Western leaders respond that he must immediately cease all military activity, withdraw, and stand down all Russian troops. They announce a range of crippling new sanctions against Russian businesses, individuals, and weapon suppliers. This alone may not stop Putin's aggression. Every bit of pressure that can be added to weaken Russia's strength and security could contribute to its eventual defeat. The following day, combined NATO and US forces, including armored brigades from Poland, head north to fully cut off Russia from Kaliningrad and encircle the exclave, with the US 6th and 7th fleets moving into striking positions in the Black Sea and Pacific. While Russia could likely muster some ground troops outside of Ukraine, they would be unlikely to launch a full invasion of any Baltic country in a conflict with the US or NATO, especially since the Baltic troops are far from Russia's best. As noted by Mike Kaufman, Russia analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, Russia's military modernization and force structure expansion had been ignoring the Baltic region until only recently. Despite provocative air and naval activity concentrated in the area, Russian forces based there are principally defensive and aging to boot. While many analysts still argued prior to the invasion of Ukraine that Russia could surround Baltic capitals in as little as 36 hours, those estimates have since come under serious doubt. In a serious confrontation with multiple NATO member states, Russia would likely take significant early losses and be forced to rely mostly on irregular warfare, missile strikes, and artillery. So back and forth missile strikes and aerial dogfights rage, along with artillery barrages and ground combat on Russia's borders with the Baltic states, while the United Nations continues to call for a ceasefire. Things are about to escalate. At this point, nearly a week into the growing conflict, Russia's resources are already strained to the point of total depletion. But Putin desperately needs something to make a statement and try to force the West to give him concessions. What will he do? Assuming that he does not opt for the nuclear option, fingers crossed, right? One possibility is to use Russia's vast geography to its advantage. So in an attempt to stretch out US resources, Russian fighter jets attempt to launch preemptive strikes against several US military installations in Alaska. These attacks are primarily aimed at disrupting communications and destroying military assets before they can be mobilized to attack Russia from the Pacific. While US missile defenses stop nearly all the strikes, several damage US communications arrays. Russia also launches another round of DDoS cyber attacks against US computer networks in order to further disrupt communications and try to sow confusion among American forces. In addition to this, submarines from Russia's Pacific Fleet begin to move, putting more of their long-range missiles within striking range of US bases in the Pacific. The US Navy responds by moving the 3rd Fleet to strategic locations up and down the west coast, and the 7th Fleet into a blockade off Russia's eastern coast, as part of an effort to counter Russia's naval presence in the Pacific. The US Air Force launches bombers from bases in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska towards key targets across eastern Russia, striking military facilities at Vladivostok, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Kamchatsky, Magadan, and elsewhere, while engaging enemy fighters over Alaska and northern Russia as part of a defensive operation against further strikes into American airspace. Because Russia has diverted many of its Pacific air defenses to the border with Ukraine, many US missiles find their targets, destroying numerous Russian air bases and communication centers. US Cyber Command also launches another round of cyber attacks against both Russian computer systems and missile silos, disabling more of them before they can be launched. Meanwhile, allied US and NATO ground troops dig into defensive positions on their respective borders with Ukraine and Belarus, as tensions over nuclear weapons continues to mount. In response, Russian troops and allied militias gather in Belarus, preparing to try and retake the Kaliningrad corridor, but by this point, much of Russia's communication infrastructure and military hardware is damaged or gone, and its forces stretched thin, forcing Putin to rely more heavily on asymmetric warfare or shock value. Desperate times call for desperate measures, sure, but do they work? The following day, Russian allied militia groups begin to launch guerrilla-style raids across the borders from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Transnistria, attacking both civilian and military targets. Running out of both ammunition and artillery, they use improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and other makeshift weapons to terrorize villages and towns. NATO forces respond with more heavy artillery and shelling and precision missile strikes for the next 2 days, aiming to cut off the flow of insurgents across the borders. Since Russia's military assets are now significantly depleted, its proxy forces fail to retake either the Kaliningrad corridor or more territory in Ukraine. Despite the growing NATO casualties due to IEDs and other attacks, the insurgents are decimated by the relentless artillery strikes. In Ukraine, troops take advantage of Russia's depleted resources to launch a lightning offensive into Crimea, shelling Sevastopol and moving to cut off the peninsula from Russia. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia's Air Force and Pacific Fleet, as well as most of its communications arrays, have been crippled by the US, putting substantial pressure on Putin. In a last-ditch effort to overwhelm NATO and US resolve, Putin orders a third, massive barrage of cyber attacks. The attacks target the wider power grid and are able to cause mass blackouts in cities across Europe and America, leaving millions without power, even as refugees continue to flood into Western Europe. EU and US officials declare a state of emergency and ask for humanitarian assistance from the other UN member states. Rolling blackouts last 2 days, during which time heavy fighting continues near Russia and Belarus's borders, both against regular troops and militia groups targeting civilians. Despite the cyber attacks, Russian allied troops continue to take far heavier losses than those of NATO and the US, and are pushed back from the edge of the Baltic states deeper into Russian territory. Holding to their word, NATO troops do not pursue them, but set up a heavily fortified buffer zone on the border. Then, after weeks of heavy shelling and being blockaded from air, land, and sea, the remaining Russian troops at Kaliningrad surrender, and the exclave is taken by NATO ground troops. In the east, the US blockade continues, as do retaliatory strikes on Russian communications and missile areas. But the surrender at Kaliningrad and mass attack on the European power grid continue to spread fears that the war will become a nuclear conflict between NATO allies and Russia. National leaders from around the world urge an end to the fighting. Despite this, Putin gives a speech raging against NATO's imperialism and says Russia will not back down if Kaliningrad is not returned to Russian control and Western support for Ukraine does not cease. With a global recession and refugee crisis deepening, the situation looks grim. Are all roads leading towards a full-blown nuclear war? After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting between NATO allies and Russian allied forces, NATO leaders announced plans for a full-scale invasion into Belarus if Moscow does not withdraw its support for separatists operating within Ukraine and NATO territory immediately. This announcement comes on top of growing speculation about whether or not nuclear war might erupt between Moscow and Washington after days of escalating combat between both sides, and the mass Russian disruption to European power grids. But despite his cyber attack, at this point Putin is out of options. Most of Russia's military capabilities have been destroyed, and there are critical shortages of ammunition, equipment, food, medicine, and other essentials. In under 2 weeks, Russia has lost tens of thousands more troops compared to the relatively light losses by NATO and the US. Its Pacific Fleet and Eastern military installations have been wiped out by the US, and in the West, it has lost control of both Kaliningrad and much of Crimea, putting the critical naval base of Sevastopol under Ukrainian control. The only major city in Ukraine still held by Russia is Mariupol, where its remaining occupation troops are dug in trying to avoid artillery and drone strikes. Most Russian forces have been forced to pull back miles from the border, where they continue to face shelling, and hospitals are completely overwhelmed. Supply lines are so destroyed that many unlucky soldiers have even begun to starve. As conditions worsen in the next few days, Putin's war effort begins its inevitable collapse. Substantial numbers of Russian troops begin to surrender or mutiny, refusing to follow orders and turning themselves over as prisoners. Finally, buckling under pressure and trying to save face, Putin announces that Russia has taught the West a lesson and is open to negotiations. An emergency session of the UN Security Council is convened several days later, where plans begin to be drawn up for a ceasefire, the return of Kaliningrad to Russian control, autonomy for areas of eastern Ukraine, and the creation of a demilitarized zone along the Russian border. Although this is just one hypothetical scenario for a US-NATO-Russia conflict, which is still very unlikely, it demonstrates some of the options available to both sides in open conventional warfare. An extremely outmatched Russia would likely have to rely on asymmetric strategies, but even that would likely do little to halt the combined efforts of the US military and NATO. With their combined firepower, logistical strength, and technology, there is almost no non-nuclear scenario where Russia could hold its own militarily. Even so, this example illustrates the devastating toll on human life that could result from even a short conventional war. But what do you think? What would happen if Russia attacked the US? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content. If you go ahead and spin the proverbial wheel of global worry today, there's a good chance you'll land on the words China and World War III. Unfortunately, there are several reasons for that, and they all lead to the question no one wants to think about. Is China getting ready for World War III? It's true that nowadays you can't go far without someone talking about the perils of Taiwanese reunification, artificial Chinese islands, Cold War 2.0, or the specifications of the latest hypersonic missile. Add to that the increasing frequency of Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace, Japan's recent decision to purchase hundreds of new weapons for its own defense, like these American-made Tomahawk missiles, and closer military cooperation between the US and Australia, and we are starting to see the signs of another global conflict on the horizon, one that is likely to begin somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. It all adds up to another doomsday scenario waiting in the wings, and some believe it could take place as early as 2024. Does China have a World War III plan in place, and if so, what does it look like? China's rise over the past few decades seems to indicate that the worrisome and likely answer to the first question is yes, and here's why. Tensions between China and the West have not been this high in a long time. Rewind several decades, and many experts would have laughed at you if you claimed you were a time traveler from the future and China posed a serious geopolitical threat to the international order. That's because the 1990s were a strange time, and not just because of the oversized jeans and kids' obsession with green slime. It was a period of untempered Western optimism. Yep, you heard that right, optimism. From our pessimism-soaked vantage point today, the geopolitical arc of that decade was almost unicorn-like, a surreal period of national unity, hope, and security, with the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. But for a while, things seemed, well, good. Emerging victorious from its 45-year ideological standoff with the Soviet Union, for a brief unipolar moment in time, the United States enjoyed unmatched power and prestige on the global stage. There were no more near-peer threats. While terrorists and revolutionaries conspired at the peripheries of power, America's military and its coalition partners, equipped to the eyeballs with the latest technology and fresh off their rollicking victory in the Persian Gulf, bought into the idea that democracy was spreading and would continue to do so with assistance and persistence around the globe. It was in this geopolitical climate that things really started to change for China, not that many Western observers really noticed. Between 1949 and 1971, it had existed behind the Bamboo Curtain, a totalitarian dictatorship under the authoritarian communist revolutionary Mao Zedong. Things changed when the United States sought rapprochement with China in the 1970s, thereafter reopening diplomatic relations and turning China into a willing Cold War partner through strengthening economic relationships and a degree of exposure to the West it had not enjoyed since World War II. China started modernizing. A lot. Americans profited, China grew. As China grew, Americans hoped the exposure to Western values and ideas would liberalize and democratize China. There were social and cultural reforms amid the modernization, yes, but not many. China's benign growth lulled the West into a false sense of security. Some pundits argue that it was in the 1990s, the heyday of American optimism, that China started really playing the long game, hatching a secret 50-year plan to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation after a century of downturns. Entangling its economy with the United States, it grew fast enough to convince the West it deserved a place in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, something it achieved by the early 2000s. Yes, we will play by the rules of international order, Chinese leaders proclaimed, with enough zeal to make their Western partners proud. It was around then its economy started booming, growing almost 10% every year for the next 2 decades. Between 1980 and 2000, its GDP quadrupled. Starting at under $90 billion in 1980, it now hovers around $13 trillion, the fastest growing increase in human history. Hundreds of millions of Chinese residents were lifted out of poverty as the country's economic potential skyrocketed. As globalization continued and China received hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment, it established a trade footprint to rival much of the rest of the world, providing cheap labor that built most of the products now adorning your home, while becoming competitive in cutting-edge cyber, space, and technology sectors. It has long since become East Asia's economic titan par excellence. It thrived under the auspices of global capitalism. It took on some of the trappings of the West, especially in its business and trade practices, but it never really democratized. To this day, it maintains its communist, centralized authoritarian regime under the singular vision of its latest ruler, Xi Jinping. And Xi has a vision, all right. Having covertly flourished under the umbrella of American power for several decades, China is now preparing the next phase of its grand strategy to catapult itself into the realm of peerless global hegemon, one that can impose itself in its Indo-Pacific neighborhood at will while projecting enough global influence to shape the rules-based international order in its own image. It's taken them 14 5-year plans to get to that point, but they've finally arrived. Now China wants to build a community of common destiny, essentially a nice way of saying it wants to coercively achieve what it views the US doing all over the world, leading international organizations, becoming a political and economic model for developing countries, being able to project world-class military power all across the globe, all while leveraging its trade relationships, allies, and partners to achieve its interests, aka replace the United States as the world's leading state. They chose 2049 for the date to achieve all of this, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, but each successive milestone for modernization has amped up the tension between China and the West. National security insiders have been sounding alarm bells for a decade now, but only recently have things started to get real. Over the past 3 decades, China has spent its way to military might. In 2019, it was spending more than South Korea, Japan, India, Russia, and Taiwan combined, accounting for over half of Asian GDP and half of all Asian military expenditures. China didn't have to just outspend their competition, however. Over the past decade, a growing number of Western defense officials have started kicking themselves for not realizing the pitfalls of economic interdependence with China. It's been no secret that for decades, Chinese spies have been stealing valuable intellectual property, including US military secrets. Just look at their latest stealth fighter, the J-20. It's a surreal mashup of the latest stealth technology, the type you might get if an American F-22, F-35, and a Russian MiG-144 walked into a bar, had one too many, and started spilling their secrets within earshot of a Chinese spy. China has stolen immense amounts of data too. Some we unwittingly give them by opting in to use Chinese-owned platforms like TikTok, data that US officials claim gives them enough personal information to identify potential targets for intelligence collection and other subterfuge. Just like the West can and probably does, China uses this data to geolocate top national security targets, recruit spies, conduct massive remote cyber attacks, and steal military and technology secrets. The issue isn't just that China has shiny new advanced submarines, missiles, aircrafts, drones, and other toys to play with. It is that it's now looking like it has the logistics, infrastructure, and know-how to use them effectively. And that's something we need to explore further. As we all know, nation-states can't just fling military power around the globe willy-nilly. You have to have the national industrial base to build up your power, the domestic support to use it, the transport infrastructure to move it, agreements in place to base it, and an effective doctrine and strategy to employ it. It took the United States 4 years of total war and victory in 2 theaters to emerge as a bona fide global superpower after World War II. Were it not for the destabilization in the aftermath of that war and the exigencies of the Cold War that followed it, it would not have many of the military basing agreements or the alliances and partnerships it now enjoys around the world today. Many of those relationships and the infrastructure sustaining them took decades, even generations, to build. And today, that is something we often take for granted. But not China. They know the price of obscurity and the difficulty of restoring national power and prestige back to superpower levels. Their long-term strategy, in part, is to achieve the same degree of global agency that the United States enjoys. It too wants bases for its military all over the world, flourishing economic relationships, and safe trade routes for its commercial fleet. Without a world war to create the conditions for its rise to power, China has had to engineer its rise artificially, partially through guile and subterfuge, partially using state-sponsored initiatives that scream, "We are trying to go global, and we will make it happen whether you like it or not." One of China's global projects that stands out from the rest in terms of ambition, scale, and significance, the One Belt Road Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Much like the ancient Silk Road that connected Chinese traders and goods with rich foreign markets, the BRI strives to achieve the same degree of global influence for China in the modern era. To understand China, you have to grapple with the BRI. Many analysts view the project as China's answer to the Marshall Plan, a post-World War II economic assistance package that sought to revitalize war-torn Europe. Unlike the Marshall Plan, the BRI is extended to any willing economic partner. Formal agreements between China, the host nation, to build economic and political ties generally precede a litany of Chinese investment, funding, infrastructure projects, tech collaboration, and more. In the process, China gets access to ports and airfields, markets for state-owned companies, safeguards for international trade, and international influence. For years, the BRI has been the litmus test for global Chinese power projection. The belt connects China with Europe and the other dozen nations on its borders via a series of overland trade routes, while the road refers to its maritime interests, fueling stations, ports, industry, infrastructure scattered throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. A great example of periphery diplomacy, BRI projects can now be found from the Himalayas to the Horn of Africa and Mediterranean basin. It has funded infrastructure deals in Malaysia, gas pipelines and railroads in Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Kenya, maintains port operations in Greece, projects in Sri Lanka, and has other projects in the works. The West has viewed the BRI warily. Some criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, a tactic of luring economically vulnerable states into taking out Chinese loans and then jacking up the rates to unpayable levels as a form of coercion over the government in question. Others fear China's growing telecommunications and economic influence over Europe and the global South. But there still hasn't been a really unified response, and China continues to shovel money into its initiative, with another $124 billion pledged in 2017. One of the big warning signs came that same year, when China decided to establish a hub in Djibouti, a developing nation strategically located in the Gulf of Aden on the Horn of Africa. China had essentially said it would never open an official military base there, and then they did, calling it a logistics facility, even though PLA Navy Marines and other forces regularly mull about with armored vehicles and artillery. It is considering similar projects in Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and Tajikistan, evidence of China's expanding military footprint around the globe. These military bases hold great potential for regional destabilization. Such developments are a warning that countries can become unwitting partners to PRC military expansion by giving China access to airfields and ports it would otherwise lack. A global footprint, therefore, is a prerequisite for China's national rejuvenation and has certainly empowered its actions at home. Maritime disputes in the waters around China are so common they've almost become normalized. These waters in the South China Sea are heavily trafficked, including some of the richest shipping lanes in the world. Xi Jinping made a promise not to militarize certain islands China artificially built in the South China Sea. Now the Parcel and Spratly Islands are militarized and can be used to intimidate and coerce coastal states throughout the region. The bullying continues in the East China Sea as Chinese merchant vessels regularly dominate lucrative shipping lanes. Coast Guard, military, and commercial ships deprive foreign fishermen of access to resources, and policymakers make ambitious maritime claims that are frequently rejected as lacking basis in international law. For the record, territorial waters are considered up to 12 nautical miles off a country's coastline, a fact China ignores. China wants to monopolize the natural gas, oil, and hydrocarbon reserves it feels it has a claim to, even hundreds of miles away. A lot of the tension arises near the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited islands that in 1971 reverted back to Japanese administrative control under the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. Over these seas, China has set out to create air defense identification zones, increasing its operational reach even further. Taken together, China's economic and cultural influence combined with its renewed military strength add up into a scary equation for Beijing's neighbors. There have also been regular border conflicts on the China-India frontier since a PRC-instigated clash in 2020 left dozens dead. India claims China has the onus to withdraw. They haven't. South Korea is worried about North Korea, China's only major Asian ally, doing something stupid. Even Japan, those guys who were so committed to pacifism after World War II that they called their military a self-defense force, are now so alarmed they're arming themselves with hundreds of Tomahawk missiles, writing counter-strike capabilities into their fighting doctrine, and conducting joint military exercises with American and Australian forces, an image that surely would have made our grandparents both proud and perplexed. And nobody should be more scared than Taiwan. The small independent island nation will almost undoubtedly be ground zero in any World War III scenario with China. Here's why. China is bent on reuniting Taiwan with mainland China. The spat goes back to World War II, when nationalist rebels fled to the island and created a vibrant democratic society, one China refuses to acknowledge or respect. Ever since, China has wanted Taiwan back more than a prepubescent teen who accidentally traded their holographic first edition Charizard for a bag of potato chips. And this is a problem, since the United States has all but formally pledged to intervene and protect Taiwan in the event China decides to invade. And boy, has it probably thought about it. In August 2022, the China State Council produced a white paper whose table of contents made China's position on the issue explicitly clear. Chapter 1. Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact. Chapter 2. Resolute efforts of the CCP to realize China's complete reunification. Chapter 3. China's complete reunification is a process that cannot be halted. Chapter 4. National reunification in a new era. Chapter 5. Bright prospects for a peaceful reunification. It's okay, you can tell us how you really feel, Beijing. We are one China, the paper alleges, and Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact supported by history and the law. Taiwan has never been a state. Its status as part of China is unalterable. The CPC is committed to the historic mission of resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification. So China is overwhelmingly focused on reunifying Taiwan. They say they won't use force. Where have we heard that before? Authoritarian leader claims he won't use force to reunify territory he believes is rightfully his. But hey, this type of tension has been brewing since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the PRC had a showdown with an American carrier group after conducting a bunch of missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. The outcome of the Taiwan issue has real global bearings. Taiwan is the epicenter of the global semiconductor industry. What's a semiconductor, you say? Anything that has an electronic chip. Your phone, your computer, your wireless modem, your electronic toys, your average ballistic missile, medical instruments, televisions, cutting-edge satellites, they all rely on semiconductors for computing. It is a $556 billion industry, one that for better or for worse hinges on the whims of a Taiwan-China-US love triangle. You see, the US sells 46% of global semiconductors, but only manufactures 12% of them. China consumes the most, importing $378 billion worth and putting what it buys into 35% of the world's devices. And Taiwan, as you might expect, has 53% of the global semiconductor market share and produces 90% of the world's most advanced ones you might see in cars, smartphones, and military tech. That's a serious share of the market. Interdependence is a problem. The US is now trying to decouple itself from the Taipei-Beijing chip drama and become self-sufficient. But Taiwan's predominance on the global chip market is one reason Beijing literally cannot afford to let Taiwan continue to independently exist. It needs to set the terms of trade in the region, not Taiwan and other Western-facing nations. Otherwise, it will always be seen as a second-rate power. What does this all amount to? Well, this situation has produced the worst security crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 20 years. China means business. As Taiwan becomes more eager to carve out its independence from the mainland, China views its very sovereign existence as an existential threat. China worries about being hamstrung behind the first island chain, a series of nations that includes the Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands, that it fears can contain and limit its ability to project power beyond its shores. Taiwan is at the heart of this island chain, a cornerstone of Western power in the region, one that perpetually transmits dangerously subversive messages of Western-backed prosperity while it remains independent. With Taiwan under America's orbit, it is a thorn in Xi's side. With a reunified Taiwan, China gains the ability to break the first island chain and wield influence deep into the Pacific. Predictably, China is throwing caution to the wind regarding Taiwan's territorial sovereignty, violating Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, and the median line dividing the Taiwan Strait, once considered as an invisible barrier between the two entities with frightful regularity. Between 1954 and 2020, there were only 4 Chinese violations of these internationally recognized demarcations. In 2020 alone, there were 380. There were more than double that number the following year with 969 incursions. The biggest came on October 4th, 2021, a day that saw 56 aircraft enter Taiwan's air defense zone, unironically coinciding with China's National Day of celebration. By May of this year, there had been a 50% increase in the number of incursions over the same span in 2021. Partially to send a supportive signal in response, the US conducted a series of high-profile political visits to the island. China didn't buy it. To them, the visits were needlessly escalatory. They responded with more overflights, setting a new record for monthly sorties. Since the summer, the PLA Air Force, PLAF, has flown over 1,000 sorties near Taiwan, 40% of them in the ADIZ or over the median line. Today, it is coming into Taiwanese airspace on a near-daily basis, ramping up its intimidation efforts around Taiwan in other ways too, from anti-submarine warfare, drone reconnaissance, and cyber attacks to the growth of its naval and missile presence in the region. China's end goal is clear. Taiwan has voiced alarm and concern over the near-constant encirclement drills, labeling them as escalatory, equivalent of a sea and air blockade of the island. If these are, in fact, dress rehearsals for a full-scale invasion, China will continue to ramp up the pressure as the time goes on. The on-ramp to war, then, is there, and it's volatile. Some pundits compare the existing slate of geopolitical relationships in the Indo-Pacific to the entangled alliance systems in Europe on the eve of World War I. This is, at least, a line of reasoning. Hal Brands, a prominent political scientist at Johns Hopkins University, has espoused comparing Japanese, Australian, and American collaboration as a latter-day triple entente, the pre-World War coalition that sought to contain Imperial Germany in the Western Pacific. It didn't take much for the World War I powder keg to erupt in the Balkans, fueling a chain reaction that resulted in the First World War. If history is any guide, it won't take much to escalate a regional clash in the Indo-Pacific into a global war either. It is here in Asia's maritime heartland where all the ingredients of a global cataclysm are conspiring against the post-Cold War period of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. One analyst observed, "It's also here where the naked edge of China's hegemonic ambitions are on full display, with dire consequences for smaller neighbors and the broader liberal international order. Here lies the defining geopolitical dilemma of our times." Well put. So how are the major players gearing up to play their part? We've already talked about China, at least their geopolitical maneuvering. Militarily, they've been following the same path, modernizing at an impressive rate to add bite to their bark as they pursue their strategy of recasting the global governance system in its own image. Its to-do list has, so far, taken a page right out of America's playbook. China has adopted the model that made America powerful, first building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, then using that as a foundation to build a truly competitive, world-class military. The fusion of civil-military power is deliberate. Industrial developments in quantum computing, AI, robotics, and biotechnology not only help China become competitive in the civilian sphere, these technologies can be appropriated to help the Chinese network their military forces. And make no mistake, this is something it is eagerly doing. To create a state-of-the-art air force, it has set a goal to fully network its combined and joint chains of command by 2027. Advancing dual-use technologies, ones that can benefit civilian and military infrastructure alike, will enable rapid information exchange between its army, navy, air, rocket, and yes, even space forces, easily setting the Chinese military apart from anything America's nearest peer, the Russians, have been able to achieve in Ukraine if they succeed. For a while now, the CCP CCP has portrayed a West in relative decline. This narrative fuels Beijing's hopes it can supplant the United States as the preeminent global superpower. And to be fair, things in the United States haven't been all that peachy over the past decade or so. Race riots, populism, rampant misinformation and fake news, capital uprisings, COVID, political polarization, mistrust, and fear have exposed internal fractures and brought American democracy to its weakest point in generations. But America has been gearing up for its marathon clash against China for years now, in the hopes that if things did spill over into a full-scale war, it would be ready. American leaders, regardless of political party, are now mostly unified on this. They know the coming struggle will be ideological and cultural as much as it will be an in-and-out technological, economic, and military competition. Still, it wasn't really until 2018 that the United States officially changed its strategic posture to address China's rise. At the tail end of 2 fruitless decades in the Middle East, its national strategy shifted to recognize China, not terrorists or Russia, as the main peer adversary. This year, the Biden administration updated its national security strategy but did not depart from the rhetoric or strategic competition that pervaded earlier iterations. American strategy emphasizes this as the decisive decade, to get ahead and win the competition for the 21st century. Some people criticize American strategy for reviving antiquated Cold War mentalities, painting over Soviet tropes with Chinese skins in another zero-sum adversarial competition that could needlessly escalate into war. Vastly different political systems aside, there are more similarities than differences between China and the United States than there were between the US and the Soviet Union, especially in the realm of economics. The two competing powers are not mutually exclusive, but disagreements and mistrust are common enough destabilizers that many fear the status quo can't be maintained for long. China is aware that it still cannot compete with the United States in many areas. The United States Navy, for instance, though technically smaller than the Chinese Navy, continues to patrol strategic waterways in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring vital sea lanes remain open for free and flourishing international trade. American carrier groups have bases throughout the first island chain. American submarines and aircraft tend to be more robust, possessing longer range and better stealth technology than their Chinese counterparts. Chinese jet engines are not as advanced as American ones. Its military suffers quality control issues with its imbalanced admixture of antiquated and modern military systems and vehicles. Its logistics and transport capabilities lag far behind their globe-trotting American adversary. And above all, the Chinese lack concrete fighting experience, having fought and lost their last major operation in Vietnam in 1979. Experience the United States coming off its own unfortunate Middle Eastern odyssey nevertheless has in spades. But the PLA's military strategy is catered to overcome these shortcomings. In a World War III scenario, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States, its allies and partners, namely Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, and possibly India, would have to operate in China's neck of the woods at the tail end of an incredibly long logistics network. The United States' geographic location makes it reliant on small overseas bases, refueling tankers, transport vehicles, and carriers to convey and sustain its units abroad. While China continues modernizing its forces and develops its own expeditionary capabilities, it has developed an anti-access area denial (A2AD) strategy to keep America and its allies at bay in the Indo-Pacific. The strategy has seen China prioritize the construction of a bristling array of ground-based missiles, naval assets, and aircraft equipped with the latest air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles that can outrange their American counterparts, and thus discourage them from intervening in a regional conflict. This active defense strategy will make American intervention in Taiwan both risky and potentially deadly. Is all of this really leading to a future world war? Most security experts will be the first to tell you that the war against China is anything but inevitable. If both powers can learn to manage their competitive relationship, they can peacefully coexist despite their adversarial posture. But wars can ignite from inauspicious sources. As Peter Warren Singer, a strategist and senior fellow at a think tank called New America and award-winning author, has written, in the coming decades, a war might ignite accidentally, such as by 2 opposing warships trading paint near a reef not even marked on a nautical chart. Or it could slow burn and erupt as a reordering of the global system in the late 2020s, a period at which China's military buildup is on pace to match the US. Singer has spent a lot of time thinking about the type of war we might expect in the Pacific. The war, he argues, will be a multi-domain conflict, meaning it will transpire in the traditional domains of air, sea, and land, as well as futuristic domains like space, the lifeblood of modern military communications, and cyber, where digital military systems and civilian infrastructure may be prone to attack. The United States has not waged a multi-domain war against a peer adversary since 1945, and so many of the lessons it learned in Iraq and Afghanistan may not be as relevant to a war with China. Likewise, years, America's traditional approach to wars has been to overmatch its enemies, relying on military technology at least one generation ahead to produce qualitative advantages on the battlefield. US forces can't count on overmatch in the future, Singer argues, since much of America's intellectual property has been stolen outright by Chinese spies, while its R&D has been accelerating its experimentation with space, drone, hypersonic, and cyber technologies. Still, experimentation is not the same as full-scale acquisition and implementation. China's two biggest vulnerabilities are historically significant, that it is reliant on imported semiconductors and microchips, things it cannot produce itself, and second, that it is heavily reliant on imported oil. The situation is not unlike Japan's in the early 20th century, a rapidly modernizing imperial power with a plucky navy totally reliant on oil imports to sustain itself. As it started to expand into China and the Pacific, seeking access to raw resources, the United States embarked the export of oil and other military goods. Pearl Harbor, the start of the last war for the United States fought in the Pacific, came in part because Japanese leaders viewed the war with the United States as inevitable. It needed an independent oil supply, something it would seek in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, and it knew if it attacked, the US would come knocking, so it needed to prevent its own geopolitical encirclement by striking a knockout blow on the American fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor. It had a narrow window, given its limited oil reserves at home, and so they attacked. Some say another Pearl Harbor is brewing, this time with Taiwan at the epicenter. Reunifying the island by force will give China access to the semiconductors it needs, but it would have to ensure that the United States could not meaningfully intervene. Toshi Yoshihara, a China expert who works at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, has warned that the PLA's views on a Pacific conflict are consistent with Pearl Harbor, and that they are predisposed to delivering a decisive first blow against US-deployed forces in the Western Pacific, particularly those in Japan. Chinese doctrine indeed emphasizes surprise at the outset of war, all part of a counter-intervention strategy to keep the Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen corridor open. Its precision strike arsenal, primarily made up of DF-21C missiles, are capable of hitting any target on the entire Japanese archipelago, while its DF-26 missiles can fire conventional and nuclear warheads almost 4,000 kilometers, far enough to strike the strategic US base at Guam. In all likelihood, if it were to spring an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, China's tactic would be to saturate America's roving carrier groups and their escorts with waves of ballistic anti-ship missiles, overcome their defenses, and send billions of dollars of valuable equipment to the bottom of the ocean before it can be brought to bear. This would help overcome the early gulf in military shipping, aircraft, and tonnage between the two sides. They would then target vulnerable American sensor aircraft, refueling tankers, and cargo ships to curtail America's ability to get close to Chinese territory. The United States has far more battle force missiles than the Chinese, meaning the total number of missiles capable of being fired in combat before resupply, but the Chinese do have enough to saturate and destroy 3 American carrier groups simultaneously, potentially turning the American naval forces in the Pacific into a moot point before a war begins. There is even evidence that they have been practicing such preemptive strikes in the Gobi Desert in western China. Such a move might be good in the short term, but short-term tactical victories do not win wars. China would then have to contend with the galvanization of American morale, the mobilization of its entire economy for war, and the possibility of intervention from many of its regional and global partners, one of whom is Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy with a powerful navy of its own. If China went to war, it would be anything but subtle. For an operation that big in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to achieve the element of surprise. Observers would see a flurry of activity in China's eastern and southern theater commands opposite Taiwan for weeks and even months prior to invasion. Ports of embarkation, airfields, field hospitals, and mobile command posts buzzing, units deploying with oil and gas pipelines, transport ships loading, commercial ships looking to provoke and escalate. The forces far from Taiwan would be placed on high alert. National mobilization efforts would increase, and the military would begin commandeering civilian vessels, ferries, aircrafts, trucks, and trains. China would have to surge its production of ballistic long-range missiles and cruise missiles for a massive anti-air, anti-ship, air-to-air, and beach bombardment. It would need to achieve a degree of economic self-sufficiency in anticipation for the sanctions that would undoubtedly be implemented. It would be a lot like what we saw in Ukraine with Russian forces massing on the border, not unlike a classic game of Risk. You mass on your enemy's border, you claim you come in peace, you are only there to defend yourself, you claim. Meanwhile, battle plans are circulating, and you are one move away from starting World War III. What's next? Unlike the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, who failed to authorize a 3rd strike to neutralize the American carrier and submarine fleet, the Chinese would have to find a way to continually pressure the Americans in the Pacific to deter further intervention. Making it so prohibitively costly, its morale and will to assist Taiwan would crumble. An invasion of Taiwan would be tantamount to Germany's invasion of the Rhineland in 1936. Unless the West is willing to stand up and deter Chinese aggression from the start, an invasion could spark emergency rearmament programs, mass mobilization, and quickly escalate into a global war. Xi and the CCP are no fools, however. They know it would be a Rubicon moment if they were to invade Taiwan, something they could never walk back from. They will have been watching Putin's adventure in Ukraine with great interest, observing firsthand how aggressive regional land grabs can spiral into an out-and-out, no-holds-barred contest against deceptively capable nations with Western backing. They know if they act, they will immediately forfeit their national image abroad and become international pariahs. In the end, China will have to figure out what ultimate victory would look like, and if it will be worth the price of an all-out war. The ball is already in their court. Reunifying Taiwan by force is a massive obstacle. Overturning an entire global order is even harder by an order of magnitude. Could China do it? Is war really inevitable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. With the amount of lethal aid that the US is delivering to Ukraine to help defend themselves against the ongoing Russian invasion, it's logical to ask, could the US conquer Russia on its own? To answer that, we need to take a closer look at both countries' militaries, compare their strengths and weaknesses, and get clear on who is the bravest and the baddest armed force out there. Starting off with a deep dive, let's talk about nuclear power. Here's the thing. We need to accept that comparing US and Russian military power will have to exclude the use of nuclear weapons by either side. Why? Well, the US and Russia have roughly equal parity in nuclear warheads, with reportedly 5,900 total operational nuclear warheads for Russia and 5,400 for the US. Included in these stockpiles, yep, it's a tie. Russia and the US each have about 1,600 active, deployed strategic nuclear warheads. However, these numbers are just best guesses, since neither country will confirm nor deny their active nuclear forces, and only rarely will they confirm where such weapons are being kept. It's scary to be kept in the dark on this topic, right? Well, it gets scarier. Apparently, Russia claims to have a working dead hand system in place, also known as the perimeter system, that will automatically launch Russia's nuclear forces if an attempted first strike is launched to decapitate Russian leadership. While this system is supposed to be offline under normal circumstances, it's not clear when Russia has this system set to on. It's quite likely that since 2014, during Russia's earlier invasion of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, this system may have been continually online, in order to prevent a decapitating first strike by US forces. It gets worse. Putin apparently placed Russia's entire nuclear forces on high alert in February of 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine and NATO and the West's response to support the defenders. There is no indication that the high alert status has been revoked. In fact, as of March 29, 2023, President Putin has announced that Russia will no longer give advanced warning of their nuclear weapons tests, following their February announcement that they would no longer allow the US to inspect their nuclear weapons sites as part of the decades-old START weapons treaty. With all these unsettling red flags in place, let's shift gears and take a look at other aspects of the US and Russian militaries. Who do you think has the best army, budget, and weaponry? The short answer is, there really is no comparison. The US military is currently vastly superior to anything Russia can muster. Everything we've seen from the invasion of Ukraine so far shows that the Russian army, navy, and air force have been completely overrated by Western analysts and have been manhandled expertly by Ukraine's outnumbered but valiant defenders. What's left of Russia's once vaunted military is being chewed up faster than they can replace them. But it wasn't always this way. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US had roughly equal conventional forces, at least in numbers. The USSR had an advantage in raw numbers of tanks and artillery, especially in the areas bordering Western Europe and its NATO member countries, while the US had a larger and more advanced Air Force, Navy, and Special Forces. But since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the two sides have grown steadily and dramatically apart. In terms of the sophistication of their tanks and aircraft, the reliability of their state-of-the-art weapon systems, and their respective capability to project power into other regions and spheres of influence. For example, Russia currently has only one working aircraft carrier, an older, fuel oil-burning ship launched in 1985 named the Admiral Kuznetsov, which, oddly enough, was built in Ukraine. This ship has suffered a string of serious accidents, from shipboard fires to repair cranes falling on its flight deck during repairs. When it does travel, it never sails far from its home port without a seagoing tug to tow it back home. It isn't even in current deployment, having been in different dry docks undergoing continual repairs since 2018, and it's known to leave an incredibly dark trail of dense smoke due to an inability for its boilers to fully burn its low-grade fuel. The whole ship is an embarrassment to the world's navies, yet it's the largest capital ship Russia still has afloat, so they'll do anything to try and keep it going. You might see it back on the high seas in 2024, maybe. In comparison, the United States is completing its second carrier in the Ford class, the most advanced and largest aircraft carrier class in the world. The US Navy currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is built around a nuclear-powered carrier. Each of these strike groups incorporates multiple ships that includes Aegis-class carriers, nuclear-powered attack submarines, destroyers, minesweepers, and additional support and resupply ships. Each Ford-class carrier will be able to support more than 75 aircraft, including the latest fifth-generation aircraft, the F-35C, along with state-of-the-art drones, airborne warning and surveillance aircraft. These carrier strike groups allow the US to patrol the world's oceans and project air power far from the US mainland. Russia has no equivalent capability, and likely never will. The same inequality exists in their respective air forces, and it's only widening. While the US has both the F-35 and F-22 fifth-generation stealth fighters, Russia's only close to but not quite fifth-gen fighter, the Su-57, can't deploy over Ukraine for fear of being shot down. Meanwhile, the US is already making progress on the NGAD, the next-generation air dominance system, which includes new weapons, advanced sensors, networking and battle management suites, redesigned jet engines, and innovative combat drones that will be designed around a truly groundbreaking 6th-gen fighter to replace the F-22, which, even though it's being replaced, still remains the best dogfighting combat aircraft in operation. The US Navy is also working on a 6th-gen carrier-based stealth fighter under the current program name FAXX. Prototypes may already be flying, and the current Navy budget has already earmarked over $9 billion in funding for further development. On the other side of the equation, Russia claims to be working on a 5th-gen plus fighter, the Mikoyan PAK-DP, also known as the MiG-41. But so far it barely exists in reduced-sized wind tunnel mock-ups, and may not be seen as a flying prototype until sometime in the mid-2030s. Then there are the respective tank forces. The US Abrams tank may not be the world's best. Some argue that spot is taken up by the Israeli Merkava, the German Leopard 2, or the British Challenger 2. But the Abrams has been battle-tested since the First Gulf War in 1990, and has been continually upgraded and improved. Currently, the Abrams M1A2 System Enhancement Package version 4, SEP version 4, will employ 3rd-generation 3-gen FLIR, forward-looking infrared advanced optics that allow tank commanders to identify and attack targets farther away than ever before. Of course, Russian fanboys will point to the much-vaunted T-14 Armata as the best tank in the world. Except, well, where to begin? The tank was designed around the A85-3 engine, a copy of an X-shaped German engine which was never designed for tank propulsion. The tank's electronics and computer controls suffer from a lack of advanced computer chips, which under Western sanctions has been a real Achilles heel for the Russian economy. Captured Russian drones show they are so desperate for computer chips that they've resorted to using stolen Swedish traffic cameras for their guts. Without a consistent supply of computer chips, there's no way Russia can mass-produce the Armata. That wasn't bad enough. The production company for the Armata, UVZ, is busy upgrading previously mothballed T-62s and supporting the overworked T-72B3 and T-90M assembly lines. Currently, any Armatas being assembled are being done by hand. That may work for limited production Rolls-Royces and Lamborghinis, but it doesn't bode well for the implementation of a mass-produced battlefield weapons platform. Without any Armatas in Ukraine, and with a greater reliance on more outdated and poorly retrofitted Soviet-era models, the Abrams is far and away better than the vast majority of the surviving Russian tank forces. I say surviving because as of March 2023, the Russians have lost, at a bare minimum, an astounding 1,900 main battle tanks. Everything from the upgraded but still outdated T-72s to around 58 of their more modern T-90s. This means that more than half of their country's entire pre-invasion active tank force has been destroyed or captured. And this number is only what's been positively verified by Western observers like the Oryx team of open-source analysts. According to the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, the total could be anywhere from 20% to 40% higher. Russia is so desperate for replacement tanks that they're even bringing in not just the T-62s from their mothballed tank graveyards, but as of March 23, 2023, even some 75-year-old T-54s and 55s. That would be like the US bringing back its Korean War-era M47 and M48 patterns. The bad news doesn't stop there. Russia has also lost around 800 infantry fighting vehicles, lightly armored trucks and transports, 2,200 armored fighting vehicles like the various MBT, MBD, and BTR models, 230 mobile command posts and communication units, 300 engineering vehicles, 190 towed artillery pieces, 370 self-propelled artillery, 190 multiple rocket launchers (MLRS), 100 surface-to-air systems, 2,300 unarmored transports, jeeps, and other vehicles. Honestly, at this point, it's almost easier to count which tanks and vehicles Russia has left, rather than try to keep up with the ones they've lost. And again, all of this has happened not against NATO or the US directly, but against much smaller Ukraine, and in just over a year. The Russian Air Force, when it's deigned to make an appearance over the battlefield, has also suffered unusually high casualties. It's estimated that 6 to 8% of its active tactical combat aircraft have been destroyed, including around 15% of its pre-invasion multi-role and ground attack aircraft, including the more advanced Su-30SM and Su-34. Douglas Barry, a military aviation analyst at the IISS, believes at least 20 Su-34 strike aircraft have been lost, along with one or two of their top-of-the-line Su-35s. And if you're still counting, you can tack on a minimum of 80 combat helicopters. Russia's navy isn't doing any better. In April of 2022, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, was sunk by Ukrainian drone attacks, though Russia at first claimed it was due to a fire started by careless smokers. Following that meme show, the frigate Admiral Makarov assumed the role of flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, but it was attacked less than a month later in May of 2022. It's not confirmed, but the Makarov might now be inoperable. All told, the Russian Navy has lost 18 ships of various sizes and has had to pull all of its ships of any value back from the western Black Sea due to fears of more air and sea drone attacks. Not a very good showing against a country that officially has no navy. Then there's the overall troop losses. According to several estimates, Russia has lost as many as 200,000 to 270,000 troops, either killed, wounded, or missing, or captured in the invasion of Ukraine. And with close to 2 million men of draftable age having left the country to avoid Putin's first conscription in 2022, those troops won't be easily replaced. Neither will the hundreds of trained pilots, nor the hundreds of highly trained elite paratroopers and special forces killed in the first days of the war in the failed attack on the Hostomel airport, and in the equally disastrous attempt to assassinate President Zelensky. And because the Russian army has never created an independent, think-for-yourself NCO cadre, and must be led by higher leaders who do all the thinking for the frontline troops, an astounding 14 generals have been confirmed to have died in the fighting. As of just May of 2022, Moscow had admitted that they had lost more than 300 high-ranking officers, a third of them members of the senior staff, namely colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors. And this is only from a single year of combat against what is arguably a second-tier military, though Ukraine is punching way above its weight class. There are several reasons why Russia's military is doing so poorly. Institutional kleptocracy. Somewhere between 30% and 40% of Russia's annual military budget is siphoned off by oligarchs, commanders, and even Putin himself, who has an estimated fortune of over $200 billion. You can't expect your tank's reactive armor to operate when someone claimed to buy the explosives but instead put egg carton cardboard into the pouches where the explosives are supposed to go. Outdated tactics. With the serious degradation of its military, both in numbers and quality, Russia has come to rely more and more on World War I tactics, namely massed artillery barrages and human wave attacks. The Russian commanders issue top-down commands that often bear little to no awareness of the current battlefield's logistics. This stems in part from Russia's incapability of creating an educated and well-trained NCO corps, which all other Western nations rely on. The inability to adjust. Russia seems incapable of learning from its mistakes. It's fought battles where its tanks bunched up and became easy targets for Ukrainian artillery, aided by spotter drones, or simply rolled through minefields without any concern for the consequences. We'll discuss one such example later on, in the Battle of the Siversky Donets. This rigidity is another result of a lack of a properly trained NCO corps, who might be able to adjust avenues of attack and better coordinate tactics at the point of opposition. The only element of the Russian armed forces that Putin seems able to rely on is his nuclear arm. And as we've already agreed, we're not including these in our discussions, for now at least. But Putin continues to rattle his nuclear sabers every chance he gets, as if that's the only way he can keep NATO and the US from placing boots on the ground in Ukraine. But it's clear from the battlefield that Ukraine needs no additional troops, just the advanced weaponry and ammunition that is already flowing into the country as we speak. There are 3 recent battles that showcase Russia's surprising ineptitude in modern warfare. The Battle for Antonov Airport, February 24, 2022. Within hours of President Putin's announcement of his invasion of Ukraine, his special military operation, a coordinated effort was made to land paratroopers, known as the VDV, and other special forces at Kyiv's Antonov Airport, otherwise known as the Hostomel Airport, named for the city in which it's located. An estimated 30 to 40 Russian helicopters led the airborne invasion, supported by a handful of fighter aircraft. If it had been successful, this operation would have paved the way for dozens of large Il-76 troop transports to land. Those planes would have carried thousands of reinforcements and would have then occupied a vital region within 10 kilometers of Ukraine's capital. Instead, Ukrainian resistance met the first attackers, and after the initial surprise wore off and Ukrainian mechanized reinforcements arrived, they managed to encircle the airport and eliminate at least 200 of the VDV in just a few days. Meanwhile, Ukrainian artillery cratered the runway, rendering it useless for the planned follow-on landing of the Il-76 transports. The VDV troops held on for weeks, supported by a few tanks and other vehicles that had broken through Ukrainian resistance northwest of Kyiv and had managed to link up with the Russian forces around the airfield, some of which had scattered into the nearby towns of Irpin and Bucha. However, the main column of Russian tanks and reinforcements heading south from Belarus, numbering up to 15,000 troops, never made it to the airport and was stuck in a traffic jam more than 40 kilometers long. In this ill-conceived, poorly supported and mismanaged attack, Putin wasted the best of his elite paratroops, as well as his chance for a quick, decapitating strike on the Ukrainian capital. His miscalculations of the strength and coordination of Ukrainian resistance, combined with his overconfidence about his own military's performance, were merely previews of the disasters that would unfold during the rest of his invasion of Ukraine. The Battle of the Svyazhsky Donets. The first year of the invasion of Ukraine has displayed time and again the lack of military coordination on the part of the Russian forces, as well as their inability to adapt to the changing military environment during the heat of battle. Time and again, Russian forces will encounter an ambush, a minefield, or simply a well-prepared defense, and rather than regroup and try a different avenue of attack, will simply plow mindlessly ahead, regardless of the losses. One such event that perfectly encapsulates all the problems Russia is having with modern warfare is the well-documented disaster known as the Battle of the Svyazhsky Donets, which occurred the 5th through the 13th of May 2022. In an effort to force a crossing of the Donets River in northeastern Ukraine, a Russian battalion tactical group (BTG), numbering between 1,000 and 1,500 troops, supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers (APCs), and artillery, placed a group of pontoons across the river near the small city of Svyazhsky. They began to send tanks and APCs to the western side, while calling up additional vehicles on the eastern side to prepare to have them cross as well. But Ukraine had advanced warning of this attack, possibly due to satellite surveillance supplied by the US. In preparation, the Ukrainian armed forces brought up both tanks and artillery, with spotter drones overhead. When around half of the vehicles had crossed, Ukrainian artillery began pounding the 2 pontoon bridges already in place, isolating the forces that had already crossed. They also pounded the now massed vehicle pileup on the far side of the river, destroying a vast number of frontline combat vehicles. Rather than give up against a prepared and alert defensive formation, Russian commanders just continued to feed more forces into the cauldron. Some Russian military bloggers went beyond calling these decisions inept and suicidal and deemed them instead to be sabotage. When the surviving units finally pulled back the following week, Russia had lost over 70 tanks and other vehicles, and by some accounts more than 1,000 troops killed, wounded and missing. Retired British Major General Mick Ryan estimated that the defeat likely resulted in not just a BTG, but probably an entire brigade, losing a large part of its combat power. While most Western militaries would see such a calamity as a reason to learn from such mistakes, the Russian command structure doesn't seem to know how to make adjustments. Additional major defeats where Russia seemed heedless of massive casualties occurred at regular intervals across the Ukrainian battlefield, including Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Vuhledar. Not to mention the estimated 30,000 to 50,000 casualties Russia may have suffered in their months-long struggle to capture the fortified region around Bakhmut. Many observers will say that the Russian-Ukrainian war might not be a fair comparison to a possible Russian-US military encounter. Isn't there some event that would provide a better metric to compare the opposing militaries? As a matter of fact, there is. The so-called Battle for the Konoko Fields, also known as the Battle of Kashan, which occurred in Syria in 2018. This was the first hot encounter between US and Russian forces since the Cold War. The US had stationed a handful of US Marines and Army Special Forces about 5 miles east of the Euphrates River, close to a vital oil drilling and pumping station in eastern Syria to help support a small group of Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) fighters, also defending the site primarily against ISIS threats in the region. Russian and US forces had previously agreed that a nominal dividing line between the two forces would be the Euphrates River. They had even set up a special hotline between the two areas' command units to make sure there wouldn't be any confusion on the ground, as the Russian troops were also ostensibly opposed to ISIS at the time. At around 5 a.m. on February 7, 2018, a force of some 250 mixed Russian Wagner mercenaries and Syrian pro-government militia attempted to cross the Euphrates southwest of Kashan. US forces fired a few artillery rounds to warn them off, and they did pull back. But later in the evening around 10 p.m., the US troops were surprised to detect a column of Russian T-72 tanks and support vehicles, along with as many as 500 soldiers, heading towards their position from the east side of the Euphrates. Sporadic artillery fire and mortar fire began to hit their positions as well. The US troops followed procedure and contacted their opposite numbers using the predetermined hotline, but the Russian commanders assured them that there were no Russian troops in the area. With that reassurance, the US troops called in massive air and artillery support involving F-15E and F-22 fighter jets, B-52 bombers, AC-130 gunships, AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, MQ-9 Reaper and RQ-7B Shadow drones, in addition to M777 howitzer artillery and M142 HIMARS rockets. The Russian and Syrian forces never got to within rifle range of their US targets. 4 hours later, when the fighting was over, more than 100 of the attacking forces had been killed, though some estimates put that loss at closer to 330. The only casualties on the US SDF side was a single wounded SDF soldier. The lopsided nature of the encounter, due to primarily the overwhelming and accurately directed air and artillery strikes supplied by the US, underscored the uneven nature of the current US and Russian military forces, as well as their relative abilities to use combined arms in a coordinated fashion. The massive response was also seen as a deliberate warning to Russia not to take the US or their allies lightly. That leads us inescapably to another interesting question. Could the US on its own invade and conquer the country of Russia? Alternatively, could the US, with NATO's help, conquer Russia? Bluntly, right now there's no way the US, even with NATO's help, could physically invade and conquer Russia. Even if Russia failed to use their nukes, and you can be certain they would, there's simply no way the vast country of Russia, stretching through 11 time zones, could ever be fully occupied and pacified. Hold on though, let's break this answer down and then we can talk about some other ways the US could possibly, actually, very probably destroy Russia. It's becoming clear in the modern age that no moderately well-supplied country would be able to be occupied and defeated as long as their people maintained the will to fight. A perfect example is the relatively tiny country of Vietnam. They were one of the first countries to soundly defeat the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and resisted French occupation right up until the Japanese invaded them in 1940. After the fall of Japan in 1945, they went on the offensive to drive the French out of their country. And when they were successful and the US tried to defend the area of South Vietnam, they fought for more than a decade before driving the US out as well, despite suffering as many as 1 million casualties. Cambodia next thought they could occupy Vietnam's Mekong Delta, but in a mere 2 weeks, the Vietnamese routed the attackers and occupied the capital, Phnom Penh, which they held until 1988. China then invaded, thinking that they could impose their will on the ruling Vietnamese government. But the Vietnamese went toe-to-toe with the mighty Chinese army and after some brief but intense fighting, managed to force them to withdraw. though China considered the event merely a short, punitive expedition. Such determination to defend one's homeland would undoubtedly be faced in Russia as well, but of an order of magnitude far greater. Many segments of Russia see the current invasion of Ukraine and the implied aim of NATO to hang a strategic defeat around Putin's neck as one of an existential crisis for their country. Since Russian media is nothing more than an echo chamber for their dictator-in-chief, most commentators mirror Putin's own comments when he says that in light of such a defeat, "I do not even know if such an ethnic group as the Russian people will be able to survive in the form in which it exists today." You can expect that, just as they did with their Herculean efforts to defend their country against the onslaught of Nazi Germany in World War II, Russia will fight on against any invasion, no matter the costs, the consequences, or the forces arrayed against them. They might even find a willing ally in China, who has been eyeing sections of Russia's Far East territories around Vladivostok that as recently as the 1850s were part of Greater China. It's entirely possible that China would be willing to help support the defense of Russia in exchange for what they currently consider historical Chinese territory. There is evidence that China has decided it's in their best interest to keep Russia as an intact nation in order to divide Western opposition. Both countries share an intense dislike of what they perceived as US hegemony throughout the world. And now that Russia has seen its oil and natural gas outlets in the West curtailed by sanctions, by necessity, they've had to turn to China and India as their two primary sources for exploiting petrochemicals. Even closer cooperation in the future is only inevitable. But wait, there's one more option. What if the US managed to topple the Russian government? This may be the trickiest of the three topics to answer. In short, yes, the US could probably topple the Putin government at any time if they wanted to. There was a recent event that showcased just how precise US strikes have become, an event that may have led Putin to decide to travel in a special armored train, and to spend much of his time in isolated bunkers in Siberia, far from the active front lines. On August 2, 2022, the US sent a pair of specially modified Hellfire missiles to take out Ayman al-Zawahiri, one of the al-Qaeda leaders responsible for planning various attacks on US and Western targets, including the 9/11 attacks, the bombing of the USS Cole, multiple bombings of US embassies in Africa, and others. He was tracked to a residence in Kabul, in the middle of a densely populated area. But the two drones were so precise that the US claimed Zawahiri was the only casualty of the operation. According to published reports, he was taken out while he stood on the second-floor balcony of the residence with the missiles equipped with Ginsu knife-like projections. The strike was publicized in a series of press conferences, with additional US government officials warning that no matter how long it takes, no matter where you hide, if you are a threat to our people, the United States will find you and take you out. No doubt Putin took that threat seriously. But US military and diplomatic policy has matured since the 1950s and 60s, when the CIA routinely toppled governments, many of them democratically elected, in countries like Iran, South Vietnam, Chile, Guatemala, the Congo, and others. Nowadays, the US prefers to let its military-industrial complex do the talking, such as when they toppled Saddam's regime in Iraq. In retrospect, despite the overwhelming military victory the US achieved, the end result was ultimately seen by many as seriously flawed, as the US had no plan to replace the removed Iraqi government with any kind of stable and reliable replacement. And that may be the one main reason why the US doesn't want to topple the Putin dictatorship. There are fears that whoever might replace him could be far worse. The one element of his arsenal that Putin has dared not yet use is his nuclear arsenal. He probably knows that as long as he doesn't employ nukes, then the West will worry he's the only thing holding back a massive nuclear war. He's betting that the US and the West will worry that whoever comes next might not hold back. And so, we've come full circle. It's clear that the one ace in the hole that Russia still holds onto is its nuclear deterrent. Putin dare not use them, for fear that doing so will unleash a horrific response from the West. But Putin has to threaten to use them in fear that their possible use is the only thing keeping NATO from sending actual troops to drive the Russian invaders out of Ukraine. And the West dare not take Putin out directly, for fear that his replacement might be willing to use nukes in an act of suicidal revenge. And so the world balances on a precarious knife's edge, closer to a nuclear holocaust than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 1960s. It would be best if all sides could take one giant step back from the precipice, but Putin seems incapable of backing down, and the brave Ukrainians are determined to take their country back, as well they should. The most likely outcome is that some oligarch will find a willing accomplice in Putin's cook staff, and the Russian president will succumb to a bout of severe intestinal distress, following which some level-headed replacement will endeavor to repair the massive damage Putin's done both to Ukraine and to his own country. At least, that's what many sane people hope. Don't forget, before he was the leader of the Wagner Group, the oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin had a very special nickname, Putin's chef. But what do you think? Could the US military conquer Russia all on its own? How would they do it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Going into war isn't always a choice. More often than not, it's a necessity. And even with NATO's support of Ukrainian independence, it seems like Putin is leaving the US less and less choice in the decision of whether or not to get more actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But if the US had to suddenly engage in a full-scale war against Russia, how would it fare? What plans is it making for such an eventuality? One thing is for sure, Putin had better buckle up. The US military keeps its M1 Abrams oiled up, its Tomahawks loaded, and its star-spangled heroes capes nearby all year round. It is always prepared and has kept a particularly close watch on the former Soviet Union ever since the 1940s. During the Cold War, the West had it easy. Despite communist coups and the proxy wars, the Americans and their NATO allies always knew exactly who the real threat was, the foe pulling the strings behind the scenes, if you will. It was, of course, the Soviet Union. For 45 years, the West had prepared, strategized, and planned for the ultimate eventuality, an all-out military confrontation with the Soviet superpower. Whether the Cold War conflict went hot by spiraling into the nuclear realm, or if kinetic operations remained firmly moored in the familiar bounds of conventional warfare, made little difference. What mattered most was that the enemy and its intentions were clear. Knowing that is half the battle. But what happened next changed everything. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s kick-started 3 decades of self-discovery as the US spread its wings as the world's sole superpower. Combating terrorists, genocidal dictators, and non-state tyrants became the order of the day. NATO members drifted apart, the alliance's mission and purpose suddenly cast into doubt. Then came a 2-decade forever war in the Middle East. We all know how that turned out. After a decade of strategic revision, the US finally embarked on a wholesale pivot to Asia, now hoping to contain a Chinese threat which had for decades grown stronger, almost in plain sight. And then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. Geopolitical clarity, it seemed, was restored. The aggressive Russian bear, whose foreign policy since the Soviet collapse had vacillated somewhere between bitter Western resentment and surprising Western rapprochement, showed its true colors. America, firmly committed to bolstering its presence in the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless seized the opportunity in Europe. For years it had been nursing its wounds, trying to restore European partnerships and alliances which had slowly atrophied under the pressure of populist politics. The invasion recast these relationships in stone. Everyone in the Western world suddenly saw the reflection of their own histories in Ukraine's existential fight for its independence. The US and its Western allies pledged collective action: sanctions, hybrid warfare, material donations, refugee support, and military training. Everything short of entering the fight themselves. This Western support coalition has shown no signs of weakening now, more than a year into the war. If Finland's recent accession to NATO says anything, it has only grown stronger. What is this all leading to? For the Americans, who for a decade could not drum up the political unity required to deal with Russian revisionism, the Russian threat is credible once more. The pivot to Asia will continue apace. But now, with Eastern European sovereignty under threat once more, America must continue to do everything in its power to prepare it and its European allies for the ultimate eventuality, a full-scale war with Russia. We know you're probably laughing right about now. War with Russia, you're saying. The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller and with 100 million fewer people than itself. The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting. More than the entire number of Russian soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia fought since World War II combined. Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to Eurasian security and Western values the world over. Western analysts are contemplating a number of contingencies that could result from the war in Ukraine. which fortunately for us all has thus far remained contained to a single country. The major one is the potentiality that Russia and its fuming dictator Vladimir Putin, finally recognizing the futility of winning a long-term victory in Ukraine, go absolutely rogue. Russia has all but burned its remaining capital with the West. Politically, Putin is a global pariah. Economically, Russia has been cut off from Western markets. Its once profitable natural gas left with virtually nowhere to go. Sanctions continue to cut into its ability to supply its military and civilian population with the specialized industrial and technological parts it needs to function effectively. Militarily, there's little evidence the latest round of mobilization will provide the tactical momentum Russia needs to win over the long term. Rather, it's more likely that untrained Russian conscripts or mobiks will continue to be fed into the meat grinder to little effect. Will Putin back down? You can almost guarantee he won't. He's already raised the stakes too high. His people, his propagandists at least, expect too much of him. He's paranoid. He must deliver on his promises. The Ukrainians, as long as they live and breathe, will never accept the Russian occupation on any scale. As a final recourse, Putin still has his nuclear umbrella, something he knows the West won't gamble on. From our vantage point today, it seems as though Putin's Russia, if it continues its present course, will almost have to go rogue. It won't end the war with a negotiated settlement unless something drastic changes, but as attrition whittles down its once vaunted military power, it will be forced to engage in its antebellum tactics, only far more aggressively. It will rely on asymmetric warfare and hybrid operations to destabilize the West. It will increasingly act like a global version of its now closest remaining ally of consequence, Iran, completely decoupled from the international community, pursuing a revanchist foreign policy using drones, proxy wars, missile strikes, espionage, and more, all while using its nuclear umbrella to deter Western retaliation. Nuclear threats will continue to grow in intensity. Cyber operations will increase in kind. Putin will target vulnerable pipelines and transoceanic fiber optic cables. Russia will continue to fund and sponsor disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Russian bots named Peter and Frank will enter your feeds at election times in the hopes of trolling you into voting for their candidate of choice. The bloodletting in Ukraine will continue. The threat of escalation will remain omnipresent. And that isn't good, because as one think tank put it, a rogue Russia still represents a geopolitical crisis of the highest order. It's a threat to global security, Western political systems, the cybersphere, space, and food security, not to mention every Ukrainian civilian. Let's be clear, Ukraine has blunted, if not outright neutered, Russia's conventional military power over the past year. That feat alone is remarkable. But this war won't end anytime soon. Russia remains a dangerous foe, and elsewhere, especially outside Ukraine, the bear can still bite. Make no mistake. So where, outside Ukraine, could the US see itself fighting Russia, and how would it do so? One of the geopolitical hotspots for a possible confrontation between Russia and the US is in a random chunk of territory wedged between Lithuania and Poland, known as the Kaliningrad exclave. This sparsely populated patch of land is Russia's gateway to the Baltic, a heavily defended former German port city ceded to the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. Kaliningrad's geography is tricky. The port is literally surrounded by NATO countries. Strategically, it's an A2AD, or anti-access area denial nightmare for NATO, home to thousands of Russian forces, advanced fighter jets, and nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. The exclave is connected to Belarus by a narrow 40-mile land bridge known as the Suwalki Gap, which itself cuts into the only two highways and lone railroad connecting Poland to NATO's exposed Baltic states. Since NATO assets cannot traverse the Suwalki Gap without coming under the guns of Russia's military in Kaliningrad, the wide-open rural region is a crucial choke point that Russia would almost certainly exploit if it ever sought to cut off the Baltics from NATO. Finland's accession to NATO has caused tensions in this region to flare once more. In a matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection. with Kaliningrad the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. Putin has had grievances against the West for years, and nobody, certainly not now, should bother trying to predict his next move. But prediction and preparation is the express job of America's military strategists. Were Putin to try to secure the Suwalki Gap to Kaliningrad or gain a foothold in Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, or any of its past satellites, the US and its allies must try to discern his regional capabilities and prepare for an open conflict. But what would this look like? How does the Russian way of war differentiate from the American approach? America is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it will be far from alone in a war against Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or their neighboring Russian borders. Russia abrogated itself from these terms when it invaded Ukraine. Now, NATO has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas using measured multinational deployments and the increased rotation of permanently based American troops. The fact America's force posture would be complemented by the presence of British, Polish, Italian, Spanish, French, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Finnish, and many other allied partners speaks to the logic of the American way of war, which in the modern era has become multinational and collaborative to the core. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. These force multipliers are not something Russia could count on in a direct confrontation with NATO. In fact, it can only really count on direct, cooperative assistance from Belarus, and amid its attempts to keep out of the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus to fight alongside it, NATO's military personnel now exceeds 5.4 million, 4 times that of Russia. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US itself, with 1.39 million troops alone, and a defense budget of $801 billion in 2021, dwarfing second-place China with a net spend of $293 billion, and Russia, who spent a paltry $65.9 billion that same year. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, each year it conducted massive, multi-day military exercises demonstrating its military power. NATO has done the same, ramping up its collective exercises over the past year in response to Russian aggression. While these exercises show little more than NATO's theoretical military effectiveness, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia into stark relief, and it has certainly been found wanting. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago. But today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, as well as military infrastructure inherited from the USSR, which no longer exists today. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. In other words, noted Russian military journalist and military analyst Pavel Felgenauer, the nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing into battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is frantically trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance, Felgenauer told the media. Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have a long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapon, but we don't always know where the target is. But what if Russia went into a full-scale war with the West despite these obvious weaknesses? Let's say for the sake of argument that Putin goes rogue. He sees Finland's NATO membership as the final straw. He still doubts the West will risk starting World War III, and he is desperate for a quick victory in Europe. He throws everything into the Ukrainian cauldron, and it all goes wrong. Armed with Western tanks and eventually aircraft, Ukraine mounts a series of counteroffensives that all but push back Russia to its own borders. Decisively defeated on the battlefield, the enemies of Lukashenko's pro-Russian faction in Belarus stage a coup and oust the leader from power. In the cascading crisis, weathered Belarusian volunteers, which for years had fought in Ukraine, return home and help throw the Russians out of their homeland. Belarus thus switched sides, leaving the Russian garrison at Kaliningrad entirely surrounded by enemy forces. The Suwalki Gap is no longer a concern for the West, but it is for Russia. Over time, Poland, Lithuania, and other NATO countries pressure the Russian garrison to demilitarize. Morale sinks. They are at the whims of NATO naval forces in the Baltic, Swedish missiles on the neighboring island of Gotland, and all but blocked from their homeland. Putin decides the time is ripe to present NATO with a sort of final act. He invades Belarus and, hoping to regain a foothold in Eastern Europe, Putin decides to test NATO's resolve, launching an attack on the Suwalki Gap and small villages along the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian borders. He uses Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles and naval missile corvettes to cover his advance. With the bulk of its reserve forces in Poland and Finland, Putin's forces overwhelm the unprepared NATO multinational garrison in Estonia, which is briefly forced into retreat. Russia immediately begins reinforcing its positions, bracing for the inevitable counterattack as NATO triggers Article 5. NATO's tripwire strategy to place small forward presence battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic to absorb a Russian invasion while it rushed its reserves to the front could not prevent Estonia from coming under Russian control. Latvia looks like it will hold, but only just. But once Estonia fell, all of NATO's Baltic states, supported by its European, American, and Canadian allies, converged. The West has wargamed this scenario over and over again, and Russian units immediately feel pressure from NATO's Response Force and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a multinational brigade on a constant state of alert. The initial surge into the Baltics is complicated by Russian missile attacks on roads, bridges, and railways. The US and NATO respond by establishing air superiority over Estonia at high risk to itself, beginning with a massive cyber attack and cruise missile strikes launched by a fleet of B-52s on Russian SAM sites that overwhelm their air defenses. Learning the lessons of the Ukraine war, NATO targets Russia's vulnerable logistics infrastructure, supplying its forward Estonian presence. Superior commercial satellites, drone technology, UAVs, electromagnetic capabilities, and next-generation precision-guided munitions fired by interoperable F-35 fighters enable NATO forces to target railway hubs supplying Putin's war in a way the Ukrainians never could. Once Russia gave up their air to NATO and the US, it was essentially game over. Kaliningrad, isolated and completely surrounded, capitulates in a matter of days. NATO continues to pour manpower and material into Estonia at a rate unmatched by Russia. Its theater assets are better maintained. It has higher morale, reinforced by a clear sense of mission. It suffers fewer casualties, a result of superior airlift capabilities and hospital facilities. It engages in full-spectrum multi-domain operations, or the simultaneous attack from sea, air, land, and cyberspace, unleashing a single symphony of violence to break down advanced defenses. It has been trained for years. Through it all, NATO member countries shoulder a fair share of the burden, thus proving the NATO concept. Russian morale breaks under a withering, round-the-clock assault. The war is over in a matter of weeks. Russian forces beat a hasty retreat to Moscow, and Putin's world comes crashing down as his people, fired up after years of disappointment, global isolation, bloodshed, and military setbacks, finally turn on him. Sure, it's all hypothetical, and yes, it's fair to claim that the West has struggled against forces far weaker than the conventional peers they would face in the Baltics over the past few decades. A fair criticism, but one equally applicable to nearly every country immersed in counterinsurgencies and irregular warfare. It's hard to believe that Russia could ever succeed in an out-and-out military confrontation against the West all on its own. If the West applies the full weight of its collective military capabilities on a clearly defined enemy, the outcome for Putin would be very, very bad indeed. His only recourse, again, would be to threaten the world with nuclear destruction. Would he really go that far? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. When you're a big shot at the world finals of any team sport, gunning for that gold, you definitely want some top-notch players on the bench. You know, those folks who are ready to jump into the game when one of your usual players is either nursing an injury or feeling way too tired. This holds true not only in most competitive team sports but also on the battlefield. And the two current global powers, the US and China, are very, very aware of this. So what would a potential conflict between China, the United States, and their respective allies actually look like? Which other military powers would both countries utilize to maximize their combat power? And could the recruitment of powerful allies be enough to turn the tides in a potential war? Let's find out. One of the features of a future China-US war would almost certainly be its multilateralism. There are plenty of reasons to assume neither power would go to war on its own. The US has spent 4 generations building a global network of alliances and partnerships which give it crucial regional access, basing opportunities, and deterrence capabilities. Its commitment to ensuring Taiwan could hold out in the event of an amphibious Chinese invasion have been relatively steadfast since the 1950s. As part of its Indo-Pacific strategy, the past few presidential administrations have been strengthening strategic relationships with key players in the Pacific to serve as a crucial counterweight to Chinese influence. These include ironclad treaty alliances with Australia, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Thailand. Recent events show the US is expanding its network even further, acting on its intention to support a strong India as a partner in its positive regional vision. More on that later. The Chinese haven't been nearly as gung-ho about building effective military alliances as the United States, which could come back to haunt them. Earlier this year, as Australia, the UK, and the US formalized their new trilateral AUKUS partnership to help Australia develop and deploy its own fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, Xi Jinping conducted a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Xi claimed the meeting heralded a new era of Sino-Russian cooperation, yet the meeting's accompanying statement only committed the two states to vague cooperative activities like joint production of television programs. There was no formal alliance. There was no overt commitment of Chinese military assistance to Russia's flagging war in Ukraine, and that might be a red flag for the PRC. Some experts have called China's commitment issues an alliance allergy. It's certainly a head-scratcher on its surface. Alliances are notoriously powerful tools for tilting the balance of power away from hegemonic states, something China is clearly trying to do. Yet, China's posturing isn't as atypical as it seems. 4 of the world's most powerful rising powers of the past century, the United States, Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, each exhibited similar tendencies. Wary of entrapment, unnecessary financial burdens, and weak regional military partners, China has similarly adhered to its independent and self-reliant foreign policy since World War II. It wanted to control every aspect of its staggering economic and military transformation in the 21st century, even if it meant that its sole remaining alliance partner is the perennially failing state of North Korea. China's confidence in its own military potential and economic growth may not be enough to best the United States and its allies in the Pacific. In 2021, the United States' 6 primary East Asian allies alone managed to collectively spend $149.7 billion in defense, already half of China's $293.3 billion, and 37 times more than North Korea's paltry $4 billion. For comparison, the United States spent $732 billion, and while defense spending doesn't perfectly correlate with military preparedness, it does go a long way. Optimally, the US-led network of Indo-Pacific states would be able to handle themselves in a theoretical war against China. They are a long way from that. A war could hinge not only on numbers of warships, missiles, and aircraft, but on industrial production, cybersecurity, intelligence, geography, technology, and interoperability. In all of these capabilities, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand lag far behind the Chinese. This year has been touted as the most transformative year in US force posture in the Indo-Pacific region in a generation. The US is the great equalizer in the equation, but there is fear Beijing's robust navy, backed by air power and carrier-killer ballistic missiles, are already sufficient to inflict unacceptable losses on American military forces in a prospective war. Naturally, the next play for the US is to try and create an uncontestable advantage and deterrent, and in the calculation of top American strategists, the best way to do that is to firmly recruit India into its cooperative orbit. And that is where things get a bit stickier. You see, it's easy to make the wrong assumptions about India, especially believing it would seamlessly float into the American orbit and become a trustworthy ally and military partner. Historically, India was a leader of the unaligned movement, a coalition of nations who tried to remain aloof from the bipolar power struggle between the US and the USSR. When, in the 21st century, China ascended to the rarefied air of revisionist great power once held by the USSR, India began to realize it could not afford to remain neutral. Sharing a combustible Himalayan border with the Chinese, India today has charted a pragmatic foreign policy with the West, seeking economic benefits and possible military cooperation as a precautionary measure in the event of a major war. In theory, India has no choice but to hedge against China by aligning with the West. China outclasses its military in virtually every category, including better missile and naval technology, a larger defense budget, more advanced combat platforms, and most vitally, a lot more of them. China might not be producing the cream of the crop in terms of modern weapon systems, but thanks to its robust domestic arms manufacturing capabilities, it can create advanced weapons at a far cheaper cost than if it had to import them. It boasts among the world's best air-to-air missiles, especially the PL-15. India has tried to break even with arms projects of its own, but hasn't had the same success. Just take the creation of the Arjun main battle tank, a platform which entered development in 1985 and was still in development, let me check my calendar, 26 years later. It all seems quite simple then, right? China the angry neighbor, the US the willing partner, India caught in the middle, fielding a perfect opportunity to resolve its security dilemma by establishing a stronger relationship with Washington. In practice, India's pre-existing geopolitical relationships make its budding bromance with the US even murkier. You see, arguably India's greatest geopolitical friendship is the one it enjoys with Russia. Yes, that Russia. India's affinity with Russia dates back to the Cold War, where the two forged close economic and military ties in response to the Indian-Pakistani conflict over control of Kashmir. The Soviets backed India when tensions flared up again in that region in 1971, signing a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation that same year. This opened up many avenues of cooperation, especially in areas of defense, oil, nuclear energy, and space exploration. India and Russia's current post-Soviet friendship continues to manifest itself in a variety of ways, including India's extensive reliance on Russian-sold arms, its decision to abstain from condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, and their participation in BRICS, a multinational body comprised of nations with markedly different perspectives on global affairs, including China and Russia. As of 1991, arms sales from the USSR represented 70% of all Indian Army weapons, 80% of its Air Force systems, and 85% of its Navy platforms. Its first aircraft carrier, the INS Vikramaditya, was Russian-made too. Its Air Force operates more than 410 Soviet and Russian fighters, and its submarine, helicopter, tank, and missile arsenals are predominantly ex-Soviet stock. So yes, considering how messy it would be to curtail access to the Russian spare parts and systems needed to maintain virtually its entire military, convincing India to cut ties with Russia is a tall task for Washington, especially when many Indians today still openly consider the Russians their brothers in arms. The winds of change are blowing, however. While the task of building a viable US-Indian partnership is staggeringly complex, that isn't to say it's impossible. As Russia and China grow closer, Washington has not delayed in courting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, offering military support packages, political legitimacy, and economic partnerships Putin can no longer promise. Russia's catastrophic military performance in Ukraine has also underpinned the visceral, mechanical, and operational failures of Russia's military systems in every domain. India had already significantly slowed its imports of Russian weapons prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, dipping from 64% in 2018 to 45% of its stock in 2022. India famously even backed out of its joint development of the Su-57 advanced fighter system, as it became apparent that it could not seriously compete with America's fifth-generation fighters. Make no mistake, India has its eyes set on a conflict with China and must prepare accordingly. To compete militarily with the Chinese threat, it will, according to most experts, have to first ditch Russia. It might not have as much time as it needs. India has a respectful level of combat experience, stretching back into its bloody conflicts with Pakistan in the twilight of the 20th century. Yet today, while violence continues between the Indian Army and Pakistan-backed groups along the border regions of West and Northwest India, by far the biggest flashpoint of tension remains along the 2,100-mile-long Himalayan border it shares with China. Skirmishes along what some consider the most dangerous border in the world have been erupting here for decades. Most recently, in December 2022, tensions between Chinese and Indian forces came to a head in the worst fight at what both sides call the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, since 2020. That year, a famous brawl notorious for its fighters' use of a medieval array of rocks, fists, and clubs, some even embedded with nails and wrapped in barbed wire, erupted in the Galwan Valley. As you might have expected, prohibitions on firearms in the LAC did not deter soldiers on either side. The bloody 4-hour brawl claimed the lives of 20 Indian and 4 Chinese soldiers, many of whom died from exposure to the elements, several more having fallen from cliffs into the Galwan River. The episode, and others like it, have inflamed tensions between China and India even further. Their military buildup in the region continues without any signs of stopping, with tensions threatening to spill out into an all-out war. Fortunately for both, geography renders both nations virtually immune to outside invasions. Windy mountain roads and extreme terrain would wreak havoc on critical logistical pipelines. Yet even if India lost territory to Chinese forces along the border, its national security would still be intact. Positioned strategically astride China's trade jugular, India could use naval power to threaten Chinese exports throughout the Indian Ocean and Malacca Strait, through which a vast portion of its energy and economic exports travel. India's lone aircraft carrier would feature prominently in any potential blue water operations against China. It's currently in the process of building another, and it would certainly need both if it hoped to deny China's access to these crucial sea lanes. With over 7 American aircraft carriers patrolling the Pacific at any given moment, and half a dozen more undergoing routine maintenance, naval interdiction would obviously be an area the United States would excel in any future war, assuming India opted to join forces. Taking a page out of China's own book, more recently India has endeavored to build its own new naval base right at the mouth of the Malacca Strait on Grand Nicobar Island. The decision, which was made to secure India's own strategic waterways and confer legitimacy on its position as a regional power, caused an uproar in Beijing. Chinese policymakers likened the Grand Nicobar facility to a guillotine stretching over China's exposed and very long neck, stretching from its southern shores all the way to the Middle East. China knows its trade networks are in grave danger. As the PRC has expanded its global reach vis-à-vis programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, its military strategy has been to build a turtle-style defense shell around the East and South China Seas and Strait of Taiwan. They call this Anti-Access Area Denial, A2AD. The system interlaces overlapping fields of anti-ship, anti-air, anti-ballistic missile systems, submarines, and other naval and aerial capabilities to alter the strategic environment in the Western Pacific, limiting the ability of the United States and its military partners to intervene in regional conflicts. Were India to join the burgeoning US-led Indo-Pacific coalition of states, Washington would have an effective means of countering the Chinese A2AD threat, supporting an allied buildup on the Indian subcontinent, which would further threaten China's ability to conduct trade and military exercises beyond the First Island chain and throughout the Indian Ocean. So if war were to ever break out between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific, India could be key in tilting the military balance of power. Russia, not so much. As China's major partner, Russia probably presents more of a liability than a boon at this point. Putin's military has demonstrated that it can barely fight a modern combined arms conflict adjacent to its own territory, much less excel or even assist in a conflict with distinct air and naval dimensionality. Most telling of all is the incredible impact that an outsized amount of advanced Western material has had in shaping Ukraine's war against Russia. In 2022, the US deployed several HIMARS batteries to Ukraine to provide long-range and accurate artillery fire, The system transformed Ukraine's tactical fortunes almost overnight, killing generals and top commanders and devastating Russian command posts, logistics nodes, supply zones, and artillery batteries. Western arms and intelligence primed Ukraine's fall 2022 counteroffensive and prevented further territorial losses when Russia bloodlet itself in its savage human wave attacks on Bakhmut over the previous winter. For comparison, the US has over 400 HIMARS batteries of its own, an order of magnitude greater than those utilized by Ukraine of late. If anything, Russia has proven to the world that the operations it can most admirably conduct are digging in, throwing poorly trained, ill-equipped conscripts into the trenches, and praying their Soviet vintage minefields hold true. That is, if it has months to prepare. It's not yet clear whether this tactic will have any discernible impact in a major war involving China. But with North Korea the only other true suitor, China is scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of reputable allies. The truth of the matter is that Russia's air and naval assets are crumbling, the two things which could impact the outcome of a potential conflict against a US-Indian alliance. Russia's air force has barely registered its presence in the war against Ukraine, with Putin only committing a portion of his available assets to that fight. We now have a better idea of why. Russia is struggling to recruit and train qualified pilots. While systems maintenance have deteriorated, a leaked memo revealed that Russia has had to send many training instructors into the war zone, compounding the kink in its training pipeline when they did not come back. Russian pilots are reported to only receive somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 120 flight hours a year. If they're lucky, their pilots receive a maximum of 200 hours of flight training before joining a combat-ready squadron. In comparison, American pilots receive even more hours than this on a training simulator before even climbing into the cockpit of a fighter jet. Their first 25 hours of true flight training come in propeller-driven aircraft. The next phase is a specialized undergraduate training program, coupling classroom instruction with 90 hours of additional flights in other propeller-driven aircraft. Then 115 hours later, they are assigned to the aircraft they'll fly in active service. Fighter and bomber pilots fly 100+ hours in a jet trainer aircraft for their next phase of training. By then, they've accumulated more hours than their Russian counterparts will by the time they've reached the battlefield. These American pilots won't be combat ready until they've completed another 20-hour intro to fighter fundamentals course. That, of course, is before they spend another year in their dedicated airframe. By the time they join their combat-ready squadron, they've got as many flight hours as a war-weary Russian combat veteran. The pilot crisis is just one dimension of the cracks in Russia's military effectiveness. It struggles to conduct the most basic of joint operations. If they allied with China, cooperations become even more difficult. Sure, the US would have to deal with the language barrier with most of its East Asian allies, yet it has a proven track record of long-term cooperation in multinational military settings, staging large-scale joint combined military exercises with a diverse array of partners across the globe to simulate harsh wartime conditions. The US too boasts decades of experience building resilient alliance systems like NATO, whose integrated command functions and daily practices promote interoperability on every level. These strengths wouldn't easily transfer over to the Indo-Pacific battlespace, but any starting point is better than no starting point. As a parting example of the importance of familiarity and trust in one's partners as the bedrock of joint and combined operations, take the United States' role in Operation Desert Storm. In that conflict, the United States managed to clear Iraqi airspace of all threats, suffering only a handful of casualties and friendly fire incidents in the process. This was an impressive feat, considering the fact that the coalition was fielding over 4,000 aircraft at the time. By comparison, Russia has been trying to field a few hundred platforms in airspace half the size, landing almost as many kills on its own airframes as Ukraine has. Just last month, Russia shot down its own Su-35 jet for a second time within a matter of days. According to a sarcastic Russian military blogger, at this rate of work from our valiant air defense, we'll soon be left without aviation. Add to this recent intelligence leaks indicating that Russia has resorted to the time-tested tactic of executing conscripts who refuse to follow orders, and threatening to execute entire units if they seek to retreat from Ukrainian artillery fire. And you have a recipe for disaster, especially if they ever hope to cohere with Chinese air and ground forces. Assuming a theoretical conflict remained conventional, China would have to do the most of the heavy lifting. It didn't have to be this way. Russia has done the entire Western world a favor playing its hand in Ukraine. revealing that it can contribute little in terms of military support in its tentative military partnership with the PRC. For now, the jury is still out on India. If it had the United States and its 50 allies and partners clearing the skies and seas over the Pacific, who, by the way, spend a third of the world's entire annual defense budget, it could play a notable role offering a credible threat to Chinese trade. Indian ships could bolster American expeditionary logistical capabilities, offer medical facilities, and serve as a jumping-off point for the containment of the PRC between the Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Oman. In the end, a US-Indian alliance is simply too powerful for a Sino-Russian alliance to overcome. This growing partnership could ensure that China's ambitions to dominate Asia and upset the liberal world order remain nothing but a pipe dream. But what are your thoughts on this? In a face-off between China and the US and their respective allies, who would win and why? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.